Good morning. Thank you for coming this early in the morning. And welcome to the 32nd Annual Frank Church Conference, Clash of Cultures, the Middle East in Turmoil. Before introducing our speakers, let me thank our media sponsors, the Idaho Statesman, Idaho Public Television, and Boise State Public Radio. Note the conference sessions will be recorded and streamed online at frankchurchinstitute.boisestate.edu. So if you miss something, you can go there and watch it. I want to extend a special thanks this morning to the Frank Church Institute board members, and especially to Rick Clausen and Amy Bergen Clausen for underwriting the appearance of former Secretary Leon Panetta on Monday, where he will receive the Frank and Bethine Church Award for Public Service. Thank you. To open our conference this morning, let me introduce Mayor David Beater of the City of Boise. Mayor Beater is a longtime friend of the Institute who has also received the Church Award for Public Service. He was just re-elected by an overwhelming majority to his fourth term. For our visitors, you should know that Boise has been discovered as one of the best places to live, and which continues to welcome refugees from the Middle East and elsewhere. Much credit is owed to the leadership of the mayor, who not only serves as an ambassador for the city, but he's probably the only American mayor who speaks Basque. Please welcome Mayor Beater.
Egunon ongi etorri Boisera. Have to speak a little Basque or I'd make him a liar here this morning. It is true that, at least according to Wikipedia, I'm the only Basque-speaking mayor in the U.S., so we'll see if I can grow the ranks a little bit. It is such an honor for me to be here this morning. I've had a chance to kick off the conference, I think. Most of the time I've been in office. Like all of you, though, it is tough when you expect to see Bethine popping up out of her chair and heckling me in the front row. But she is with us all, and this conference and the Institute are a tribute to both her and Frank. This year particularly, not just as always a great group of speakers and dignitaries, but the timeliness of the topic I don't think could be better. And Ambassador Pickering's reputation precedes him, a distinguished career at the top echelons of those who create our nation's foreign policy. Then, of course, there's Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta has done everything. White House Chief of Staff, Director of Office and Budget Management, CIA Director, Defense Secretary. What's little known, he also played quarterback for the previous Los Angeles Rams when he was in California. I think that's the only thing he hasn't done. It is such an honor to have him with us this week as well. For all of us locals, get ready for another thought-provoking conference. For those of you from out of town, welcome to Boise. It's my hometown, as was indicated, and obviously I'm partial, but my favorite city. I think you'll enjoy your time here, and you'll find us to be a very welcoming city. We are so welcoming, in fact, that last April, the White House Task Force on New Americans gave national recognition to our Neighbors United network. Neighbors United is a coalition of more than 100 community leaders that work to help refugees successfully integrate and thrive in Boise. This is one of the reasons I'm so excited for this year's conference. As a refugee resettlement community, this topic impacts our community and how we view ourselves as Boiseans. Being a welcoming city is part of our effort to make Boise the most livable city in the country. And in order to be successful at that, we have to make Boise livable for everyone. But over the last few months, world events and a presidential election have caused an extraordinary and, to me, a disturbing shift in our national dialogue that is setting us back in this effort. Unfounded fear of change and the unknown has caused our conversations around the topic of refugees to become inflamed. We must guard against this. Refugees are individuals and families who were forced to leave their homes because of the kind of extremism and violence we saw in Paris. And Boise has been a refuge for such people since the late 1970s, beginning with the Vietnam War. As a community, we will continue to work with the federal government and our local partners to help refugees successfully integrate and thrive here. Welcoming people displaced by war is the right thing to do and has a long history of support in our community. Boise was built by immigrants, our parents and grandparents, hardworking people who believed in the American dream, and we will continue to welcome refugee families seeking protection and a brighter future. I've met many of the refugees currently living in Boise. They are an impressive group of people, teachers, doctors, attorneys, important people in their homelands before being forced to flee. They share our values of working hard, educating their children, and living in a safe, secure community. Welcoming these individuals and families is not only the right thing to do, it makes unquestioned business sense. Refugees on the whole are the more entrepreneurial than others. Embracing diversity is a frequent topic in my conversations with local business leaders. They understand that diversity and fostering our reputation as a welcoming city for all gives us a leg up in retaining and recruiting the businesses of the next century and the highly skilled, well-educated, multi-ethnic workforce they depend on. Countless experts across the nation agree. Job creation and economic innovation are much more likely to happen in economies and communities with companies that welcome diversity and new perspectives. We now look back with admiration on the immigrants, the Irish, the Mexican, the German, the Basque, the Chinese, who left their homeland more than a century ago seeking opportunity and finding it here in Boise. Yet those same intrepid, industrious newcomers were just as often viewed with suspicion by their contemporaries because of the language they spoke, the religion they followed, of the color of their skin. We know today that they were a key force in building this city into the wonderful place it is today. It's hard to imagine Boise without its connection to our Basque heritage. In fact, those of you from out of town, make sure to visit our Basque Block in downtown Boise. Setting ourselves apart, standing up for what is right, always striving to build a better, thriving, and welcoming city. That's the Boise I know. That is what we mean when we say we are working to make Boise the most livable city in the country. I'm hopeful that the conversations at this conference will help us put our situation and the situation of those seeking refuge among us into perspective. So again, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to the Frank Church Institute for giving us all this opportunity to examine one of the most challenging issues before our society. Here's to a great conference. Thank you very much.
Now let me introduce Dr. Corey Cook, the Dean of the School of Public Service at Boise State. Dr. Cook is formerly at the University of San Francisco, where he headed the McCarthy Center for Public Service. He was named last summer as the inaugural dean of Boise State's new School of Public Service, which will serve as a training ground for future public servants at all levels of government. The Frank Church Institute, which includes the Frank Church Conferences and scholarships, as well as the Frank and Bethany Church of Public Affairs, looks forward to becoming an integral part of the new school. Dr. Cook.
Good morning. Good morning. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the university and the School of Public Service. The School of Public Service was created in July for three core purposes. One is to prepare our students to be ethical, thoughtful, courageous leaders in public service, whether that's in the public sector, the private sector, or the nonprofit sector. We were created to promote high-quality research that would be impactful, whether that's academic research or applied research. And we were created to promote informed and reasoned discourse, something that I think is desperately needed. I made the mistake of watching the news last night. And so the idea of having a thoughtful, informed conversation here this morning is something that I'm eagerly looking forward to. I first want to acknowledge the faculty in the room, not just from the School of Public Service. I know we have some faculty from the College of Business and Economics and also from Arts and Sciences. Could the faculty please stand up and be acknowledged? So obviously we're going to depend heavily on our faculty. We're also going to depend heavily on our institutes and centers. The Frank Church Institute, my dad was a Frank Church delegate when he was running for president in California. And had he won just a few more votes in California, he would have gone to the convention. I grew up knowing Frank Church as a poster on the wall in my dad's office. And obviously the legacy of Frank Church, not only in this state but around the country, is an important one for our students to emulate. We hope the students in the room will get to know the legacy of Frank and Bethune Church, and also the important legacy that many of the people on the Frank Church board have set forward. I mean, this is what living lives of engagement and ethical and creative and thoughtful leadership is about. So we want to thank all of our guests for being here. We want to acknowledge the Frank Church board. If I could ask the Frank Church board members to please stand up, I would appreciate that. I have to say, this is one of the great perks of my job, as I get to interact with these amazing people who care a lot about the university, who care about this region, the city, this state, and care a lot about the issues that we're going to be talking about over the next few days. So again, thank you to the board members. As Gary said, I think the Frank Church Institute is integral to where we're going as a School of Public Service. I think we can't do our work without the type of energy that you bring to campus, a way of engaging our faculty, engaging our students, raising important issues, encouraging conversations, convening people together who may not agree but can figure out how to disagree based on evidence and information, and not just because it's fun to shout at each other. So again, thank you for being here today. I'm looking forward to what's going to be an incredible few days here on campus. Thank you again to the board. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here, and welcome.
To kick off the conference speakers this morning, we're going to call on Ambassador Thomas Pickering, and it would take his whole time if I mentioned everything that he has done in his distinguished career. But briefly, he was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. That's the highest ranking career service officer position, and he holds the rank of Career Ambassador, which is also the highest rank. He was ambassador not only to the United Nations, but to 6 countries: Russia, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. So without further ado, let me introduce Ambassador Pickering.
Mr. Mayor, Dean Cook, faculty, students, friends of the conference, and attendees. Gary, thank you for the very kind introduction and for the privilege and the honor of being here and saying a few words to hopefully kick off this particular important conference. Middle Eastern turmoil. It's always somewhat tentative when one chooses the title for the Middle East ahead of time. Unfortunately, you've struck pay dirt. And I would suppose that in all reality, the Middle Eastern turmoil might well apply for 98% of the last 100 years. In any event, it is an important conference and an important time to look at the Middle East and how and in what way it fits. Before I say more, let me join all of you who have expressed your appreciation for the life and service of Frank Church. I had the privilege going back a few more years than many of you, to the privilege of testifying before him when he was a member of significant committees overlooking foreign affairs programs at the State Department. And I found him incisive, very intelligent, very knowledgeable, and unlike some of his colleagues, preeminently fair with witnesses. And we all respected him. We knew we had a challenge when we had to testify to a committee of which he was part. But we also knew that he made seminal contributions to this country. Increasingly, I think, in a field which we sometimes lack interest in. How can public service be and remain ethical, honest, and transparent? And those were the kinds of things that Senator Frank Church stood for, and the kind of things that I think make his memory and the school here in his memory an important contributor to our own country's future. Years ago, I was told that all good sermons come in 3 parts, and so I usually try to construct my talks around 3 parts. Today, I want to speak a very little bit about the importance of the Middle East to the United States in terms that I think you will all find familiar and unstartling. I want to then speak about the salient problems that I believe need addressal, and perhaps to close or to incorporate in that part of the conversation a few thoughts on things that we might be doing, that we may not be doing, or that we might be doing a little more vigorously to deal with some of those trenchant problems, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. My sense is that we have not had a worse time in the Middle East. The really interesting question is, can it get worse? And I'm afraid, unfortunately, my simple answer to that is probably yes. The Middle East seemingly has an inexhaustible capacity to run downhill when it's not working its way uphill. And something that I believe that is true, particularly of the Israeli-Arab problem, is that the bicycle principle applies. If you're not riding forward, you're falling down. And so neglect the ability to set the Middle East on the side, or policies of significant non-involvement for the United States mean, in fact, that we get significantly involved in increasingly bad times in the Middle East, and that's important. The Middle East is important to us for historical reasons. We've had long connections with it in our own history. Everything from the Barbary pirates to the missionaries who wanted to go and convert the Christians of the Middle East to Christianity. We have obviously had serious educational relationships with the Middle East. And we've had long-standing ties with the states of the Middle East through all sorts of reasons. And not just with Israel, but obviously, too, with the Gulf Arab states, in the historic past, certainly with Iran, where Americans played a major role beginning in the 19th century. And we have had, obviously, important trade relationships, not the least of which is energy. And while we are more energy independent, our friends and allies around the world are not. And so, obviously, dependence on the Middle East for energy is an important construct of the kind of global world we operate in and we want to see work. A world in which there is trade and open exchange and the movement of ideas and indeed joint prosperity. And so the Middle East is important for that. The Middle East is a crossroads, in many ways a transportation hub. Much of the back and forth between Asia, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere moves in, around, and through the Middle East. The Suez Canal, the major air routes, among other things, are important determinants as well of our economic prosperity and the future prosperity of our friends and allies and others around the world. And so we must look at it. And for those of you who look from this country, perhaps in my judgment, as interested in and devoted to religion as many around the world, it is a source of the wisdom and indeed the particular genius of the 3 great monotheistic faiths. and that in many ways our laws, our moral code, our system of values, and our basis from judgments come from ideas that originally germinated and were generated in the Middle East, and as a result are a deep part of our heritage and a deep part of how we judge what we do and what others do. Middle East, in many ways, if we were speaking 5 years ago, would be a lot simpler place to talk about and describe, and maybe even to prescribe for. It has gotten more complicated. My view is territorially, the Middle East, in many ways, occupies much of the space between the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, and the Hindu Kush, the Himalayan mountains that form a border between China and India. Heavily influenced by Islam, but not exclusively so, an area that has large Arabic-speaking population, but also speakers of other languages that have been historically also Muslims and devoted to their religion in that part of the world. It is a region which we used to describe back 2 decades ago as the 3 I-word countries: Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Palestine. At various times in the history of the region, these 3 countries, or these 3 regional problem issues described by country names, have played an important role in American foreign policy and will and continue to do today. But they have been added to, in a very real sense, by the change that began in Egypt now 3 to 4 years ago, but spread throughout the region and brought hope originally that there would be major change for the good. They have, in some ways, brought major change, the end results of which we do not see and now continue to find seriously challenging, and with which we are intimately and deeply involved. And one of our policy controversies in this country is whether we should be more involved or less involved. We've tried military force and a real and significant presence on the ground, which has cost us blood and treasure. It has not left us with the kind of wonderful solution that we used to see on the Hollywood movies of the 40s, where the heroine and the hero marched hand in hand off into the sunset with something like the William Tell Overture playing in the background. Rather, we see something quite different. We see a region that is still struggling to deal with the major problems of Islam and modernity, a region that is trying to deal with multiple ethnic diversity, with religious differences, and indeed with tribal and clan differences that go back sometimes multiple years. Iran is, in my view, a relative bright spot, where a few years ago it was certainly not that. A relative bright spot because we are now on the verge, perhaps, of implementing the agreement reached on July 14th, 2015 on the Iranian nuclear program. And much remains to be seen about where things will go. I will just say 2 things about that. Having spent a lot of time looking at this agreement and having spent a lot of my career dealing with nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation, the agreement is much better than I would have predicted to you 3 years ago. The agreement's not perfect by any means, but it is an important agreement because, in effect, it employs more inspection and monitoring than any previous agreement. It employs serious limitations on Iran's nuclear development, such that we have, as many estimate, at least a year to deal with a violation and a very good chance of discovering a violation. But we will be faced very shortly with lifting sanctions. Many of us who've studied the agreement did not realize until we looked at the fine print that when sanctions are raised, there will be no permission for any American primary company, with the exception of the aviation industry, to work directly with Iran. We will revert to the sanctions that pre-existed the nuclear sanctions, and they continue to bar that. What will be permitted is American company subsidiaries but without the presence of American personnel to be permitted to engage in business activities with Iran. And Iran will not be permitted insofar as we have influence in the world banking system, and we do, to use American dollars for its business activities. These are important continuing limitations, and we ought to keep those in mind. And so those who predict the death knell of the agreement the moment the sanctions are released, I think should also understand that while the Iranians may recover $100 billion of their own money embargoed in foreign banks, at least half of that, by the judgment of our Treasury Department, is already owed and must be paid to foreign creditors. There will be some money, obviously, for Iran to do what it wishes. But one of the reasons why Iran has moved so rapidly, exceeding the estimates of my American expert friends and colleagues in complying with this agreement, is that they have a very important election for parliament in one of their key assemblies at the end of February. And they, in the new administration in Iran, the Rouhani administration, want to show the people of Iran that the agreement brings benefits to them. And so the return of the funds, and indeed, hopefully, some of the new stimulation of the Iranian domestic economy will be an important priority for Iran. We need to watch that very carefully. I spent 3 or 4 days in Israel at the beginning of December. The government of Israel has not been keen about this agreement, to say the least. But the message that we got from Israelis, both pro and con the agreement, was that it was singularly important from their perspective that we do all possible to assure that there is no slip-sliding in Iranian compliance with the agreement. And I have to tell you that up until now, whenever we detected a difference with Iran on how the agreement should be interpreted and therefore complied with, the Iranians within a few hours accepted our interpretation and complied. But we'll have to wait and see where that goes. And I suspect the early return of our sailors was another item of clear indication that the Iranian administration needs this agreement as much as we do and will comply to assure, in fact, that elected administration's own political survival is at stake and will be part of the continuing process. Nothing is going to continue to be easy with Iran, but this is a relatively bright spot in a tumultuous and turmoil-ridden region. Iraq, ISIS, and Syria are perhaps our biggest preoccupation. And while, interestingly enough, our friends in Israel, in the main, see Iran as the biggest problem in the region, they also share our concern about ISIS, but don't see it affecting them now as much as we see it affecting the whole region. It is important, in my view, that the major effort we are making, interestingly enough, in parallel with Iran, in supporting Iraq and forces in Syria that are dedicated and committed to work against ISIS, is moving slowly, but I think it is making progress. The concern I have is that we have not yet been able to get the key players in the region to pay enough interest to the politics. I'm deeply concerned that the Sunni minority in Iraq is still feeling the effects of being dominated by the elected Shia majority. And the elected Shia majority has not yet adopted the painful but important principle that where there is majority rights, there also must be full respect. Where there is majority rule, there must be full respect for minority rights. And so that's the kind of problem we face, but because failure to deal effectively with the Sunni minority not only provides a recruiting ground for ISIS, but doesn't provide the material, the support, and the ground forces that the anti-ISIS forces will need to deal with them, and that's important. I think also it is not possible to deal with ISIS without considering Syria. I said to friends here last night that Secretary Kissinger said a few months ago that the famous rule in the Middle East that the enemy of my enemy is my friend no longer works. And in fact, there are too many multiple opposing forces, particularly focused in Syria, for us to take that simple proposition as a way of dealing with the problem. There are Sunni versus Shia controversies. There are Arab-Persian. There have been traditional Syrian and Iraq differences. There are Turkish-Kurdish differences. There are differences between those who like President Assad and those who want to get rid of them. There are many who are opposed to ISIS, some lukewarm, and some unfortunately supportive. And we need, obviously, in that difficult mix, hopefully to play the kind of leadership role of intelligence, of strategic sensitivity, and of tactical flexibility, which can help us move forward. Until the month of October, my deep sense was that while it was clear from prior UN activities what kinds of constructs were necessary to move toward a political settlement in Syria, it was not clear that very many Syrians were prepared to face up to the difficult compromises required. It was also clear that while everybody in Syria had trouble accepting the notion that there was no immediate military solution in Syria, most people outside of Syria had come to the conclusion that that was probably correct. And what happened in October was an interesting beginning of a transformation still freighted with problems, but nevertheless a beginning. What happened was that as President Putin moved military forces into Syria, I think in large measure because both he and Iran had judged that President Assad was losing serious ground rather than gaining. In a quiet way, conversations between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia began to move in the direction of seeing whether, in fact, a political process could be started. And while we don't agree on a lot of things, at least there was an agreement that a political process should start that should include Russia and the United States, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the major Gulf states, and the European countries of significance to the region. And I'm particularly pleased to note that Secretary Kerry, during the week and a half before the conference was settled upon, went to Saudi Arabia and spent a good bit of his time, I'm sure with the support of the President, convincing the Saudis back in October that they should break their prior policy conclusion and attend the meeting, and they did. And that meeting took place with a result that was perhaps a little bit beyond expected. There was a general conjunction of views that both an expanding ceasefire and the beginning of a transitional government was necessary. A transitional government obviously indicated that those who favored Assad were prepared at least to hazard his continued perpetual existence as leader of Syria in a political process. And those, like many of us, who were deeply concerned by the damage and depredations being done to the people of Syria, were certainly fixed on the idea that a ceasefire could help to bring humanitarian relief and an end to killing and the movement of refugees and displaced persons and all of the tragedy that has affected Syria. That process continued for a second meeting. It has now been interrupted by the differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We have, I think, wisely stayed out of taking sides on that issue and pushed both countries to come back together because of their importance for the end of the problem. There is at least postulated a meeting at the end of January. Whether it will take place or not remains in serious doubt because of those differences. But what we have seen is that perhaps for the first time in a serious way, Russia and the United States over this issue can get together. And they may be the necessary condition for progress, but not yet the sufficient condition. And so the next steps have to involve bringing Syrians into the process and seeing whether, in fact, these great ideas, now being more widely accepted, can be adopted as operational necessities in that conflict. Still much ahead, still much turmoil. I want to spend just a few minutes at the end now on the Arab-Israeli problem, the Israeli-Palestinian problem, a problem that has for 30 years defeated most of the major efforts to seek the kind of universal solution that will be necessary, both to assure that Israel continues to exist in security on the one hand, and that the Arab states in the Middle East have been able to adopt a policy that both is able to assure that they have the full right of self-governance on their own, but are part of a region where cooperation is a formula for success and continued contention only for more turmoil and difficulty. Secretary Kerry, with the support of the President, spent almost a year working on this some time ago. It did not prosper. It did not prosper, in my view, for one or a number of reasons, but much of them add up to the question of, were the political leaders, both in Israel and among the Palestinians, prepared to take on their back the very difficult compromises that had to be made, particularly when each of them had a somewhat shaky political backup for their own leadership in their own groups. The Palestinians, with differences between the mainline Palestinians, the former PLO people, and Hamas, and in Israel between a government of the right with a one-vote majority in the parliament and an opposition split among many factions, and where Prime Minister Netanyahu's traditional posture has been that he will rule with the right and leave the process of dealing with the peace, if I could put it this way, to put it this way, posterity perhaps plus a certain amount of delay. That, in fact, has once again emphasized two things. There is no easy answer out there to the stalemate, certainly no easy answer working through the political leadership that's there. But secondly, the bicycle still plays a role, and we are seeing Palestinians, particularly in the month of December and now into January, taking out individually, I believe, their deep concerns and frustrations by violent acts against mainly innocent Israelis. This is a difficult problem, and one that once again is not far from the headlines, despite the turmoil in the rest of the country. I have a simple idea. I don't think it's widely supported, and I suspect it will go nowhere, but I want to share it with you in any event. With that kind of buildup, obviously, you can all go to sleep. But I think it's an important idea. Up until now, we spent 35 years seeking peace by getting the political leaders to work for a breakthrough. My view is it's time to reverse that thinking, at least temporarily, and that we in the United States, in the lead with the rest of the international community, should produce the substantive breakthrough to convince the political leaders on both sides that there is something really out there that they can work for, and that will be a better construct than the one in which they live. And so my sense is that while the United States from time to time has made suggestions, it has been very shy of presenting what I would call a kind of corpus of ideas and principles that can help to guide the negotiations. And many of those, I think, are understood and well known. This would not be a diktat. It would not say this is the treaty. It would be open, in my view, and should be open to the U.S. supporting anything the parties can agree to on an equal and just basis. But it also ought to be putting on the table something that gives the parties what it is that the international community is supporting, and what it is, by lack of seeing it on the table, that is among their favorite ideas for solution that the international community is not prepared to support, which is very important, because each side, partly driven by domestic politics, has exaggerated ideas of what it might be able to get at the table. And so this may be, in a sense, an exercise in transparency and truth-telling. I wouldn't expect the parties to grab on it right away. If we're successful, both of them will oppose it with equal vehemence. But what we will be able to do, whether we do it that way or take it to the UN Security Council, which is another way of doing it, we will be able to put a consensus of the international community before the parties that when they come to need to have these negotiations, which they will have an outline, and they will have an outline for their own people of the kind of difficult compromises they will have to address, and including the direction of the answers. And so it is a legacy question, perhaps, for the Obama administration, but it is, in my view, very important to set the stage, because at the moment we have only one significant UN resolution out there that says territory for peace. And that, in my view, is very important. And we have an Arab peace plan that it says they accept territory for peace, and if there is territory for peace, they will have relations with Israel. But we need now gradually to increase what I would call the area of potential consensus and common agreement, if not with the parties, at least around the parties, as a way of trying to trigger more future progress in this situation. Well, it's been great to talk to you. It's been wonderful to describe the turmoil, devastatingly difficult, obviously, to bring out a few areas where we might see change. But my hope is that with careful work, the implementation of the Iranian effort can move on to more and useful areas of cooperation, that what we have started to do in Syria and in Iraq to challenge ISIS and seek resolution to those conflicts, as difficult as it may seem now, has at least put us on a railroad track that can take us toward the station, and that ideas about the future of the Israel-Palestine problem are out there. They are not totally absent. They require a certain amount, obviously, of strong political commitment to get there, but that process always has. The rest of the area, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Jordan, where I spent a lot of my time, in Libya and beyond, we have wonderful panels coming along to discuss. I can't say that I can give them bright flags of hope out there for the subjects that they will discuss, but we have real expertise today, many friends and many people who I've admired over the years to talk to you about those issues. And I'm delighted to have been here at least to lay out some thoughts for the beginning of this process. Thank you for the honor of doing so. And if we have a few minutes, maybe I can address a few questions. Thank you.
In regard to Israel and Palestine, what are your thoughts about the two-state solution? Do you think it's viable, or?
Thank you very much. We've had much discussion on it, and some of the failure to be able to produce results around a two-state solution has caused people, I think, for the last 5 years to begin to think about the death of the two-state solution. And the death of the two-state solution is an interesting question. A number of years ago, I felt that in addition to the bicycle principle, there were several other principles that applied in the Middle East. And one of those was that the only thing harder than finding peace itself is finding a way forever to destroy the peace process. And so, in effect, I see the two-state solution somewhere in that construct. Those who believe the two-state solution is dead because it's very hard, and I agree with that, do not have yet a good construct to offer as an alternative. Those who talk about a one-state solution, which is the logical alternative, have on one side a deep sense on the part of Israel that it would have a Jewish state but not a democratic one, because, in fact, a state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River would have, if not now, very shortly, an Arab majority. And if, in fact, that were a one-state solution under democratic arrangements, then the Jews, who have now been able to celebrate beyond their 50th year in a state of their own, would be in deep jeopardy in not being able to continue a state that they could call their own. And on the Palestinian side, a deep sense that perhaps if there is this one-state solution, how and in what way are they going to be accommodating to a very large Jewish minority that has to be respected and whose role obviously has to be part of the future of the region. And so I don't see the one-state solution around the corner because there are fundamental roadblocks. But I do see the two-state solution around the corner because there are roadblocks, the answers to which are very hard, but necessarily seem to me to be within range of solution. And so I think it is important to continue to look not just at the massive problems that stand in the way, but also the important possibilities that are out there. And years ago, I used to say there were really only two kinds of American diplomats in the Middle East, optimists and lunatics. The others couldn't survive. And I am not yet ready to certify myself, even if it sounds like it. Yes, ma'am. Over here.
Yes. As we look to a world that gets beyond fossil fuels, which I hope will be coming in the not too far distant future, oil has been very important in the Middle East. How would you see perhaps a world that's not fueling its energy by oil affecting that region?
Well, I think it's going to affect that region seriously. And I think we see the beginnings, not just of Iranian interest in civil nuclear power, on a basis that at some point either two things may happen to their fossil fuel reserves. The price may drop down so low that they're out of business, or indeed they may wish to hoard their fuel so that the price, in fact, goes up at the end of the day. But turning to nuclear power, which is a worrying problem, in part because of the weapons potential, in part because of the further proliferation potential, and in part the problem of what to do with the waste material at the end of the nuclear fuel cycle, is not an illogical problem. And we have Saudi Arabia, and we have Turkey to some extent, Egypt traditionally, the United Arab Emirates, which is building reactors, all turning to nuclear power to try to find a way, perhaps in the future, not to have to rely as much on fossil fuel themselves in their own corner. The notion that perhaps fossil fuel will disappear entirely is a great hope, but at this point a very tough and very difficult concept to see coming into effect, and we're having a hard enough time at the Paris Agreement being able, in fact, to be comfortable with the notion that the arrangements there will get us safely only to 2-degree warming. At the moment, most of the experts believe, in fact, that while they are a great step forward, they are not yet there technically to be able to achieve that particularly important objective. And I believe that as a result, perhaps areas where fossil fuels continue to remain important for non-energy relationships, petrochemicals, for example, we will still see an important use for those kinds of raw materials. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Excuse me, yes. I'm considering the fact that money is so vital to political existence and survival that it seems that it's been difficult for the American public to get an accurate picture of what's happening in the Middle East, in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, because of that. And I'm wondering if you see the political will changing in some way to have a true solution achieved in our political process. Diplomatically, I can see progress, as you expressed it, but it seems politically it's still very difficult to address that because of money.
Well, I think two things. I think money plays a very important role, but not the only role, and in some cases not the seminal role, but that's a philosophical argument we can probably have offline. I think the second question is a very important question. And to some extent, the Arab-Israel question has begun to be sublimated by worse problems. And so to some extent attention has turned from it, and there is not a lot of attention today, which is the reason why I'm very pessimistic about my ideas or maybe any others that I can think of that might catch the imagination or indeed persuade individuals that the enormous sacrifices that have to be made and the kind of compromises that will have to be reached are worth taking on. But the only thing I can tell you about that is that Einstein once famously said, keeping on doing the same thing and expecting a different result is a good definition of insanity. And so maybe we are at that point, and maybe we have to do it. George Shultz once told me, in great respect for him as Secretary of State, he said, Pickering, when you're in a deep hole, stop digging. So we have both of those wonderful aphorisms to counsel us at this very difficult time on that problem.
You mentioned that the United States has important connections to the international banking community. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, we originally had a gold-backed currency that was abolished under Richard Nixon, and we've since gone to a petrodollar policy of backing the U.S. currency by trading in oil. This has been enforced through the Freedom of Information Act. We can read Hillary Clinton's emails, and we find that part of the reason we invaded Libya was because they planned a gold dinar, an alternative to the French franc. France cited wanting greater control of Libya's oil production as one of the reasons for the invasion. So my question to you is, do you believe in national sovereignty and that countries should be able to trade their own commodities on their own soil in whatever dollars or whatever monetary denominations they want to, or do you believe in wars of aggression to overthrow that?
Well, I think that I'm not an economist. I've heard the assessments that you've given. I don't agree with them because I think that the major question that was at stake at the beginning of our intervention in Libya was the question of the safety of the people of Benghazi and the region in the face of the declared objectives of Muammar Gaddafi as he and his forces approached that part of Libya. However that may be, I do believe that we have been fortunate that because of our strength, size, and power, the stability of our currency, that the world has believed that trading in our currency and holding our currency has had the strength of the stability to give them trust in that particular currency. I was in Russia when President Yeltsin devalued the ruble, and within a year, we were issuing new $100 bills. And I was very concerned that in Yeltsin's devaluation of the ruble, he ignored the small bills, and many indigent Russians suffered greatly as a result. And I was very worried that at that time there was $30 billion in American currency literally under Russian mattresses in $100 bills. And I got the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Secretary of the Treasury to spend $1 million of Federal Reserve money to advertise in Russia that we had never abandoned, disowned, or dishonored a single American note, and that we were committed to do so. And the catastrophe which I expected might happen didn't happen because of that advertising campaign and our ability, in fact, to assure people in Russia that our currency was still good. We have played a little bit fast and loose with that in our sanctions program against Iran. My view was that it was worth doing, but I think we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful when we use financial and banking sanctions that we have the rest of the world with us. Because if we don't have the rest of the world with us, they will do exactly what you said. They will move to other currencies to seek to find the store of continuing value and stability that they find in the American currency, because we are beginning to play with our currency politically to achieve objectives. If we have coherence and support in the objectives, and look, we had the Russians and Chinese throughout the whole process, then I think we can put our currency on the line. But I would be very cautious about advocating it, because others will look at new currencies to be the world standard, and we will suffer some setbacks as a result. Now, I don't think it will threaten the survivability or even the prosperity of the United States. But it will be a construct that works in our long-term foreign policy interest if we don't defend our currency and handle it well. And I would not be in any way advocating using military force to defend our currency, and I think that is like the famous Scotch verdict, not proven.
Thank you.
How much does lifting sanctions against Iran allow them to further fund Hezbollah and other terrorist activities?
It will. The question, of course, is what will they do? But nothing that we have done with respect to sanctions has led me to believe that they have in any way failed to do what they wish to do with respect to Hezbollah and Hamas. And look, beginning on November 24th, 2013, in the first deal, we agreed to release each month $700 million worth of Iranian money locked up. And we have done that faithfully. And if my simple high school math is right, that's about $16 billion that have already flowed to Iran. And if, in fact, they were going to use that money for nefarious purposes, I suspect at least we would have somebody's intelligence community, if not ours, the Israelis, telling us that we were going to hell in a handbasket and all this money was being used in ways that were devastating to our interests, and we should stop. We haven't seen it. So the answer to your question is yes, of course, it's their money, and they have the right to use it the way they want to use it. And we will oppose, as the President has said, vehemently, any efforts or actions on their part to build further terrorist links or to work in military ways against our interests, including, in fact, the willingness to take further sanctions. And we are not precluded from the agreement in taking further sanctions for those purposes. We are precluded from the agreement if Iran is complying with it in putting more sanctions on for nuclear purposes. And so there are important differences here. But I'm glad you asked that question. It's a significant one. And the answer is not, in my view, altogether totally satisfactory to us, but it's a risk that we believe we have been prepared to take to avoid what we believe to be either an Iranian nuclear weapon or a military activity against Iran to prevent that. And I believe that risk is worth taking. Thank you all very, very much.
Our first panel this morning is titled 5 Years After the Arab Spring, What Lies Ahead? This is the discussion that follows a Frank Church conference held in 2011, which was focused on the Arab Spring. The panel moderator is Dr. Isaac Castellano, a lecturer in political science at Boise State. He's the author of Civil War Interventions and Their Benefits, Unequal Return and the Forthcoming, The Breakdown of the State-Sanctioned Militias and Vigilantism Growth in the 21st Century. It's a mouthful. Dr. Castellano, please. And the panelists, if you join him.
Thank you, Gary. I want to thank Gary Winsky, Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute, for all of his hard work. I popped into his office. Yes, please. None of us would be here without him today, and I popped into his office on Wednesday, and he was busy, so I know he put in a lot of work to pull this off today. My name is Isaac Castellano. I'm a lecturer in the Political Science Department. I'm very happy to be here with two very distinguished gentlemen who have had a long career in international politics and in the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service. I met them both last night and they suggested that I give the shortest intro to both of them, and they suggested that I say that there were two jokers from Washington. After speaking with them, I found out what couldn't be further from the truth. Both of them have had a very long and distinguished career. So I'm going to give a little intro to each of them and then say a few words about the Arab Spring, and then we'll hear from them for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. And there's mics obviously on the other side. So let me introduce first Gerald Feierstein, Ambassador Gerald Feierstein, who has spent 41 years with the U.S. State Department Foreign Service. He is currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, which makes the title of my book look actually not so bad. If you're not familiar, the Bureau of Near East Affairs is essentially covering Morocco to Oman and then Iraq and Iran. So obviously the bulk of the Middle East, all of the Middle East, and the topic of our conversation. Before his current position, he was our ambassador to Yemen from September 2010 to September 2013. And if you've been following Yemenis politics, it is a dicey place. Before that, he's had several overseas appointments in Pakistan 3 different times, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Israel, Lebanon, and of course Yemen. He has previously served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Coordinator and Deputy Assistant Coordinator for programs in the Bureau of Counterterrorism from 2006 to 2008. He's served as the Desk Officer for Nepal, Pakistan, and Egypt, Deputy Director in the Office of Arabian Peninsula Affairs, Director of the Office of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh Affairs, and as the Director of the Office of Regional Affairs in the Near East Bureau. So quite a career. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. On my left is Dr. Graham Bannerman. Dr. Graham Bannerman is a scholar at the Middle East Institute and a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute for Peace, Chairman of the Board of Hands Across Along the Nile, board member of Partnership for Secure America and the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. He is a former staff member for the U.S. Senate's Foreign Relations Committee that was chaired by, he was on the staff while it was chaired by Senator Frank Church. He's the founder of Bannerman Associates, an international consulting firm that's worked with numerous governments. He's previously taught at Georgetown University, George Washington University, and the American University of Beirut, and he served as an international observer of elections in Georgia, the Philippines, Haiti, Pakistan, the West Bank and Gaza, Mongolia, and Yemen, and he also has a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin, where his dissertation covered Oman politics in the turn of the 20th century. So very glad to have both of you guys here today. So before we hear from them, I just want to say a few words about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was one of those moments that gave Americans a lot of hope. The Middle East, as we just heard from Ambassador Pickering, is a place of turmoil and has long been that way. So when the Arab Spring began, Americans saw a little bit of ourselves, of democracy, in the streets of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco, among others. And we know that in order to get change in places where there's no room for voice and political discourse, you need people to go out into the streets, and that's what was happening. Cairo, most famously, obviously, is Cairo's Tahrir Square, and all of the democratic potential there. And following it were elections in Tunisia and Egypt. And there were downfall of these long-term authoritarian leaders, Gaddafi and Mubarak, signs of change. And for a while there, it looked like Assad was going to go in Syria with the numerous defections from the political and military elite. And then came Morsi in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, and later the removal and the return to a very authoritarian flavor in Egypt. Obviously, Syria descended into chaos with the rise of ISIS. Iraq's military that we had spent so much time preparing for this moment was easily defeated and major cities were lost. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict continued, unabated. Libya emerged as a failed state. Refugees flooded into Europe, and more recently, ISIS-inspired terrorist attacks in Paris and San Bernardino have, along with the chorus of presidential candidates, have brought Americans' attention back to the Middle East after working so hard to get away from it in a lot of ways. The conflict in Yemen has emerged as a proxy fight between the Saudis and the Iranians at a time when our relations with both those countries is a very delicate point. And on top of all of this is the structural factors that remain in the region. Low unemployment, high birth rates, poor governance, the Shia-Sunni sectarianism, the rise of violent extremism. So here we are 5 years after the Arab Spring, and moving forward, what really clear option does the United States have? Are we to pull back from trying to manage these situations, or as some of the presidential candidates have advocated, be more forceful and more interventionist in the region? Is democracy, human rights, transparency, and governance really an option if our interests are going to be achieved there? Is the choice between an ISIS-type model or an authoritarian strongman like the Mubarak or Assad? Really, what do we do about the Iranian-Saudi conflict, and how do we manage who becomes the dominant player there? And what do we do about radical extremism? How do we manage that problem? And really, is there anything that Democrats and Republicans can agree on? Is there any clear way to move forward in this complex, layered problem? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Firestein, and hopefully we will hear some answers and get some guidance on these important issues. Thank you.
Do you want to stay? You want to just stay at the table? I'll stay over here. Yeah. Thank you, Isaac, for the introduction. And I always feel very old and tired when I hear all these different things that I supposedly did. Before I start, I do want to thank all of the people here at Boise State and at the Frank Church Institute and the community as well. This is the first time that my wife Carolyn and I have had the opportunity to visit Boise and the state of Idaho, and we've been delighted to have received the warm welcome and to really be a part of this beautiful community for just a short period of time. So thank you very much for that. Before we talk a little bit about where we think things may be going over the next 5 years, and certainly I would give any thoughts about what that might be with some awareness that if anyone had asked us in 2006 what we thought the situation in the Middle East was going to be like in 2011, I doubt that there would have been anybody who would have guessed that the fall of Mubarak, Gaddafi, and several other very experienced and long-serving leaders would be washed away. But we can talk about that a little bit. But before I do that, I do want to give a little bit of a sense of what I think some of the key aspects of the Arab Spring were. And again, I think that we need to be a little bit careful in terms of generalization, because we always need to keep in mind that each of these societies that was affected by the Arab Spring has its own unique character, its own tradition, its own culture, and that the issues that led to the outbreak of popular movements really was, in all of those cases, very unique to the circumstances that people were experiencing there. But having said that, let me make a few very general comments. As Isaac referred to, what we as Americans think of as the Arab Spring was, in fact, the popular movement, generally led by young people, by women, civil society organizations that came out in the street in protest. and that had mass movements that occupied squares, Tahrir Square in Cairo being the most famous, Tahrir Square in Sana'a was the one that we experienced. There were a few things that seemed to be the core motivations. I would say that the economic conditions that were applying in all of those societies was the prime motivation. People were generally moved because of high rates of youth unemployment. The fact that many of these young people were recent college graduates who got out of school with absolutely no prospect of ever finding gainful employment, and a backlash against that. I think also the lack of opportunity to move forward, a long history in many of these societies of crony capitalism, and the inability of people from the outside to come in and carve out for themselves and for their families meaningful economic futures was a strong motivating factor. There were also social and political elements to the protest movement. The fact that corruption in these societies was something that people felt very strongly about. There was a sense in these societies of stagnation, of societies that weren't able to move forward and to give brighter futures for their citizens. These were all issues, and of course the other aspect was the rise of social media and the fact that that information that had been tightly controlled by these governments and these societies for generations was collapsing in the face of satellite television, of internet, of Twitter, of all of the various elements that allowed people to be aware of and familiar with what was going on in the world around them in a way that they had never been able to do in the past. And therefore, you had a generation and a group of people who, for the first time, were becoming aware in a very immediate way that their part of the world was being left behind while the rest of the world was moving forward in a very dynamic and changing way. So that was, in a capsule description, the kind of the Arab Spring that people saw on their TV screens in 2011 and 2012. There were other aspects of the Arab Spring that were less positive and that, in fact, laid the groundwork for ultimately the failure of these Arab Spring movements to succeed, with the possible single exception of Tunisia, and we can talk about that a little bit separately. But some of the basic flaws in the movement was that there was no real organization. This was not a group of people who came together, worked together, organized themselves in order to accomplish it. They were disparate groups. They came to their protest movement for different reasons. Sometimes they worked together. Sometimes they were in conflict with one another. But they never gelled as a unified movement. The other key point, I would say, is that they misunderstood their own population. They misunderstood where the rest of the citizens were. The people who came out in the streets were, by and large, they were urban. They were more educated. They were more aware, perhaps, of what was going on. They were less bound by the traditions of their culture and their society. That is not true of the majority of those societies. And so you can say that, in a sense, the Arab Spring was premature, and that one of the reasons that it didn't succeed was that the movement started before the populations were ready to respond and to receive it. The other major flaw, I would say, is that they personalized the Arab Spring. They personalized their movements. And so while they talked about the need for larger social reform and economic reform, they generally believe that if you change the leader, if you removed Hosni Mubarak or Muammar Gaddafi or Ali Abdullah Saleh, that the problems would be solved and that the people would come together and they would organize themselves in a way that was more positive and more open for the future. That was not the case. The issues and the problems in these societies went far beyond just the single personality of the leader. And they were really structural, and they were really central to many of the failures of these societies. So on that basis, you might ask, this is a great thing. You look at, the Arab Spring, and a lot of people I know drew parallels between what happened in, say, Yemen or Egypt, and compared it to what happened in Eastern Europe and the colored revolutions and some of the movements. So how could this go wrong? Well, again, I think that part of the problem was that the broad-based popular support for the movement simply wasn't there. That they never had really captured the hearts and minds of their fellow citizens, and they didn't know how to go about doing that. In Yemen and Libya, at least, there were other issues that came up of sectionalism and tribalism. These are heavily tribal societies, and a lot of the response and the reaction tended to pull people back into the tribalism or sectional identities that they had before. In the absence of their own ability to organize themselves, the Arab Spring groups were vulnerable to the intervention of other political groups and parties. And so one of the things that you saw was that these movements were captured by other political parties that had their own agendas, whether you're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Joint Parties Congress in Yemen, some of the other groups that they moved in, and they basically pushed aside this grassroots movement, this popular movement, and used the opposition to the leadership in order to advance their own political agendas, and eventually, as in the case of Egypt, to succeed through a political process. And then the last element was that you had a counter-revolution. You had the response of entrenched elements of the ancien regimes that were able to come back, whether you're talking again about the deep state in Egypt or the groups that remained loyal to Saleh in Yemen or to Gaddafi, and there's still Gaddafiite groups in Libya, and so they were able to come back and to try to regain and reassert control successfully in Egypt, less so in some of the others. The one kind of outlier in all of this was Tunisia, which has, after a bit of a rough patch, been able to move forward and to succeed in accomplishing some of the core objectives of the popular movement. They successfully completed a constitutional process. They've had elections. They now have a coalition government in place that is trying to move forward and accomplish many of the objectives of the original protest organizers. So why is Tunisia different from the other states? You have to give some credit to the political leadership that was there, particularly Sheikh Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the head of the Islamist group in Tunisia, who had the good sense to hold back and not to try to gain short-term advantage, but to be willing to play for a longer strategy and a longer-term sustainable transition. But the other, and what I think was the most important element in Tunisia, which was certainly not the case in Libya or Yemen, was that you had an institutional foundation in Tunisia that worked. You had a government that was capable, even in the midst of political chaos, of continuing to perform the basic duties of a government. And the reality in Libya and Yemen was that when you pulled off the Band-Aid of Gaddafi and of Ali Abdullah Saleh, there was nothing underneath. There was no government. There are no institutions that are able to manage affairs. And so whereas Tunisia managed through this period of a very difficult political confrontation and political transition to continue to function as a state, neither Yemen nor Libya were able to do that. And they left themselves open to a vacuum and to having that vacuum filled. So those were, I think, some of the core elements of how we got from the optimism of 2011 to perhaps the more realistic appreciation of 2016, and trying to look forward a little bit. What I would say, what I think we've learned from the lessons of these last 5 years and how we may think about the next 5. I would say that the most important thing is that the Arab Spring isn't over. And I know that there have been some appreciations, and in fact, yesterday, this is a timely event because January 14th is observed in Tunisia as the anniversary of the beginning of the Arab Spring there, and which was the beginning of the Arab Spring throughout the region. Looking forward, we need to recognize that this is going to continue, and that perhaps it would be more accurate to say that we've come to the end of the first act of the Arab Spring, but there are at least 3 or 4 more acts that we have to look forward to over the coming years. The factors that led to the outbreak of the protest movements in these societies in 2011 haven't been addressed. They haven't been resolved. The economic challenges are still there. Youth unemployment is still high. Corruption is still a feature in most of these societies, or all of these societies, really. And therefore, if governments can't demonstrate that they have either the will or the capacity to get in front of these challenges and to actually deal with them in a meaningful way, I think it's only a matter of time before we see the protest movements come back out into the street and a return to the demands for new and more responsive and more open governance. Egypt is particularly vulnerable to this. The economy is suffering there. The tourism industry has collapsed as a result of some of the terrorist attacks that they've suffered, and I think overall in the region a decline in the number of people who want to go spend their holidays there. There was a great deal of anticipation that opening a second channel of the Suez Canal was going to lead to economic growth and to a resurgence of the vitality of the Suez Canal as a major channel for international trade. That hasn't worked out. Shipping is way down in Suez. And the Egyptians have been heavily dependent over these last couple of years since General Sisi took power on the largesse and the support, particularly of Saudi Arabia and of the UAE. But as you're all aware, with oil prices dropping from $100 to somewhere around $30 today, with a lot of anticipation that they may be heading further down to 20 or even below. The ability of the Saudis and the Emiratis to continue to underwrite the weak economic performance of Egypt is becoming more and more strained. and therefore, if there isn't some turnaround in the Egyptian economy, I think it's questionable whether they're going to continue to get the multiple billions of dollars in assistance from those societies in the coming years. On the other side, the challenges and the reasons, the foundation for the inability of the protest movements to succeed has also not been resolved. The lack of organization in the protest movements hasn't changed. There's a question whether these movements will do a better job this time than they did the last time in actually building a broad-based popular support for what they're trying to accomplish. Will they begin to speak in the language that the majority of their fellow citizens understand and can appreciate? And will they have a commitment to sustain their engagement over a long term, which was a commitment that they were not willing to make early on in the movements in 2011. So, and then the other part is that, again, particularly in Egypt, what we've seen is that the counter-revolution, the return of the deep state, has further entrenched its position, and it has taken steps to try to guard against a repeat of 2011. And certainly, if you look at the arrests in Egypt as a prime example of trying to sustain their position through increasingly repressive measures, not only against the Muslim Brotherhood, but also against liberal reformers, while emphasizing and building popular support by positioning themselves as the guarantors of security and stability in a country that was shaken by several years of very chaotic and weak leadership. That these are things that will make their position more difficult to change than we saw in the Mubarak era. In Yemen and Libya, again, the two states with the weakest governance and security institutions, they have been further challenged by the outbreak of civil conflict. Civil war in Yemen and in Libya has further weakened and delayed any kind of effort to build the institutions that would allow them to secure the political transition and to begin to build a society that would be more responsive and more open. And in both of those societies, those elements of the protest movements, the reformers, the ones who were advocating for a broader vision of the way forward for their societies, have been silenced. They've been subjected to harassment, to arrest, to disappearance in both of those societies. In addition to that, and Ambassador Pickering talked a little bit about the rise of sectarian tension. Of course, we're all aware the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran as it plays out in intensifying Shia-Sunni issues in several of these states, not all of them, but definitely, for example, influencing the conflict in Yemen. Obviously, a foundation for the conflict in Syria, as well as the inability in Iraq to address some of the issues and begin to function as a government. The resurgence of sectionalism and tribalism, and often you'll hear people talk about the end of Sykes-Picot, this idea that the nation states that were formed following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 is threatened, is challenged. And that perhaps several of these societies, and here again talking about Iraq, about Syria, about Yemen, even about Libya, that they may split into multiple countries, which would create even a greater basis for insecurity and instability in those areas. The spread of ISIL, which is expanding. Not only is it in the Syria-Iraq theater now, but it's certainly in Yemen. It's certainly in Libya as well. And not only in those countries is it a challenge, but also keeping in mind that the highest number of foreign fighters currently in Syria and Iraq are from the Maghreb. They're from Tunisia and from Morocco. And that's at some point, someday, many, if not most of those fighters are going to come home. And therefore the threat that they can promote the same kind of instability in those societies that we saw in Algeria in the early 90s when the Algerian fighters came back from Afghanistan is certainly an issue that is of concern. The other major issue that we see on the horizon is what's going to happen in the Gulf, and we haven't really talked about Saudi Arabia and the GCC states and the possibility that they may also be affected by the same kinds of popular uprising that we saw in the other states. But the fact of the matter is that although many of those the populations of those societies have been largely apolitical over the years and willing to accept what has been considered to be the basic social contract or compact between the governments and the populations that they accept without question the leadership of those governments in return for a very strong social safety net, of government public sector employment, of many of the core elements of social safety. And is that social compact going to be challenged now? Is it going to fray as oil markets crash? Will the inability to sustain that social security, cradle to grave kind of approach fray also? And is that going to lead to demands for change? And then also, of course, the governments in those societies have deep concerns about the rise of political Islam. One of the reasons that they've been willing to support General al-Sisi in the way that they have is because they see the Muslim Brotherhood and similar kinds of extremely conservative Islamic organizations as a threat to their own legitimacy and their own security. So all of those are core issues that I think can affect the way issues play out over the next 5 years. I would say, again, as a kind of a set of final remarks, that we're at the beginning of the process. We're not at the end. We shouldn't underestimate the challenges that remain. And I didn't really get into the issues of Jordan or Algeria or Morocco. Also, potentially societies that are going to see rapid changes over these next few years, but a little bit different. I'll be a little bit different than I think some of my colleagues might be in saying that despite the challenges, I think that we still have reason for optimism, that these political transitions are going to continue, and that eventually they still have a good chance of succeeding in achieving the kind of transitions that the original protesters wanted to achieve, and to help address and to meet the political and economic aspirations of their populations. I also believe that there's still an important role for the United States to play. And I would make a couple of comments here. We need to remain committed to this transition, and I recognize that patience is not generally a virtue that's celebrated in the United States. And that people often lose interest and a willingness to stick with issues if they don't see things moving in a positive direction. This is going to be a long and bumpy road for these societies. We're not going to see steady improvement. We're not going to see a straight path. I'll refer to Isaiah Berlin, who once said that nothing straight ever came out of the crooked timber of humanity, and that certainly is a factor here. it's not going to be a straight path. But if we remain committed, if we remain engaged, if we continue to put resources against achieving objectives, then I think that we can play a positive role and we can help influence the outcome in ways that would be good for the region, that would promote security and stability and economic prosperity in those societies, which also, of course, is in the interest of the United States. And then the last point that I would make is that we also need to always remember that ultimately this isn't about the United States, it's about these societies. What happens in these societies isn't a referendum on American policy. It's not a vote of approval or disapproval for the President of the United States. What it is indigenous movements, people trying to achieve better futures for themselves and their societies, and that we should support it for reasons that it's good for us, but we shouldn't personalize it. And let me stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now, Dr. Graham Bannerman.
It's always great to be the guy following Jerry and Ambassador Pickering.
Because it's so easy to knock everything I said down.
You should understand, when Jerry says he's an old guy, it really makes me feel bad because he was the young guy coming into the office in the State Department that I was in already in the 1970s. Let me just put this in a little context about myself. I spent 3.5 years of my life writing a daily analysis of Arab-Israeli affairs for the Secretary of State and the President. And I asked the guy who asked me, why are you doing this? Why did you ask me? And he said, because you always look at things differently than everybody else. So I will live up that today. I think the problem with the Arab Spring has been our analysis. I think we have been in trouble from the beginning on this because we did not understand the underlying events in the region where we were in history. Please understand, I'm a historian, not a political scientist, and therefore I take a longer approach to these things. I first went to the Middle East when I was 18 years old, traveling around by myself, and I watched the Russians building the High Dam in Egypt as an 18-year-old. When I think back on that, I was really dumb, but it was very interesting. But it gives you a perspective. In the summer of 1967, my wife and I were married in the summer after college. I told my daughters that was a good thing to do. They waited till well into their 30s before they got married. The day after we were married, we moved to Beirut. And we spent the next 3 years in Beirut. And so everything I've learned is kind of firsthand. One of my commitments in life has been the education of Middle Easterners to American education. I taught at the American University. I've raised tens of millions of dollars for scholarships for kids in the Middle East to go to American educational institutions so they can learn about us. I've always felt that was one thing we could do as Americans that would help them in their lives and have a long and lasting impact. However, in reality, the people in the Middle East who think like we do, the ones you hear on television, the articulate English speakers in Tahrir Square, the people on television don't represent the overwhelming majority of people in the region. They are different than we are. They view the world differently. Doesn't mean that we're correct and they're wrong, but they're different. I think of it in many simple ways. When I was teaching at the American University, I'm a Midwesterner, and Midwesterners are very simple and not complex people. We tell you what you think. We don't have much to hide. The kids were on strike. The Palestinians were blocking the gate of the university, trying to keep us from going to class because the Israelis were bombing South Lebanon. So I, as a naive Midwesterner, went up to this guy and said, don't you think, I appreciate why you want Palestine, I understand you're concerned, I would like it to be like that, but don't you think you could do more for Palestine? By going to class, becoming doctors, becoming lawyers, becoming engineers, you'll be a much more effective advocate for Palestine. And this kid looks at me and says, don't get logical with me. But what he was saying was actually more profound than that. It sounds funny to us. But what he was saying is, don't try to apply your Western logic to this question. We have other considerations. You see the differences in many different ways. For example, when we as Americans say, that's history, we mean it's over and done with. When they say it's history, they mean it's written in stone and you can't change it. It's there. The other thing is, they tell you what they think you want to hear. So in a conversation, in order to avoid a conflict, they tell you. The perfect example of this is Ahmed Shalaby, who came to Washington in the early 2000s and convinced the establishment that went into the Bush administration that if you go to Iraq, throw out Saddam Hussein, they'll be throwing roses at you, you'll be welcome, it's absolutely welcome. He believed it, he thought it, and he found people in Washington who wanted to believe it. And it turned out not to be that way. The way you solve a problem in the Middle East is not the way we do it. We argue, we fight, and do this, and we come to a conclusion, we cut a deal, and it's over. They don't do that. They build the consensus. We've got to get everybody under the tent together. We've got to come together, we've got to work on it. It's because if they get to the conflict, it actually becomes conflict. And so they want to avoid that at all costs. So they work for consensus. And lastly, and the most important thing, our society is built, the building block of our society is the individual. It's you, it's me, I go vote, that. There's not the individual. It's the family, it's the tribe, it's the community, it's the religious group. When I make a decision, I'm making it for my community. I'm not doing it for me. And therefore, when they look at problems, they solve them differently. So when we go out there and say, we want to have democracy like us, they're working on a community basis. How does that work? How does that work out? Now, the other great change in my lifetime is when I went to the Middle East and you asked the average person in the Arab world in 1967, who are you? The answer would be, overwhelmingly, I am an Arab. That was the common answer. And what did that really mean? It meant that Arab nationalism was the goal and aspiration of the largest percentage of the population within the Arab world. And where did that come from? When the Ottoman Empire was falling apart and the Turkish nationalism was there, the Arabs developed a common identity, principally among the minorities, because the minorities were terrified that the identity would be religion. And if you were an Arab Christian, and there were lots of Arab Christians, you would be left out of the pie. You would be outsiders if we could be identified by religion. So Arab nationalism became this identity. They also had a way to address the West. How do we address the challenge of the West? We do that by adapting Western principles and following them and changing to be like them so we can succeed like them. I mean, the political parties were communist, socialist, capitalist, liberal Democrats, Christian Democrats, but they were all Western oriented. So they were trying to be like us. And Arab nationalism was the wave of the future. That's what they were going to be. There was always a minority, though. The minority said, no, 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 no. We don't address, that's not the right way to address the West. The way to address the West is to be true to our own beliefs. This is the true conservative approach. First, you have to be true to your own beliefs, and when you're true to your own beliefs, you then can confront them. But if you're not true to your own belief, you'll never confront them. And those were the Islamic fundamentalists. They were always there, they were always a minority in society, but they were a minority at that time. At about the time of the '67 war, you had Arab nationalist regimes in Syria, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Libya. You had people, Libya was a kingdom, but Arab nationalism was growing there. Algeria, Arab nationalism was the dominant philosophy. The humiliation of the Arab armies, the Arab nationalist armies in '67 began a process by which it's a process. It wasn't some revolution, everything changed. More and more people began to turn to the conservative approach, my Islamic identity. We need to be true to our own values. If we chase those values, it's bad. This was complicated by the Arab nationalist regimes became old, they became corrupt, and they became discredited themselves domestically. So over the period from the 67 war till you get to 2011, you've had a gradual transformation in the identity of the people of the region, which we weren't paying attention to this. We were kind of, but not. We didn't understand the significance of it. So today, when you ask the average guy in the Middle East today, who are you? The overwhelming majority say, I'm a Sunni or I'm a Shia. The consequences of that for the minorities is awful. If you're a Christian and all of a sudden your religion identities are holding us together, you're in trouble. If you're a Druze, if you're a Sufi and not a pure Shia, it's a problem. It is a huge problem within the region. And so when these revolutions began, started by all the young guys who I was helping to educate, those type of people, they didn't represent that much was going on. The beneficiaries were going to be the majority of society who had this other identity. And that was underneath going on. We missed it. We just didn't see it coming. But it was everywhere. That doesn't mean that everybody handles it the same way. Each country, as Jerry says, is very different and has a very different history of it. But that was going on. There's two countries, however, where they don't say, I'm a Muslim by my identity. Those two countries are Lebanon, where they say I'm Lebanese, and Egypt, where they say I'm Egyptian. And you can't understand the events in those countries unless you understand the different identity. In Lebanon, it's a little complicated because, well, everybody says we're Lebanese. There's no consensus on what that really means. In Egypt, when they say they're Egyptian, they mean they're Egyptian. You know, countries, Egypt is a country that's not a country. It's a civilization. And they look at themselves as a civilization. They see themselves differently. The Iranians are a civilization. The Turks are a civilization. The Chinese are a civilization. We as Americans don't deal well with people who see themselves as civilizations. They don't have the necessary appreciation of how important we are because we've been here 200 and some years. So what happens in places like, what happened in Egypt, I'll focus on, is the young people started the spark in Tahrir Square. But they could not have succeeded if they didn't get the support from two key elements of Egyptian society. The Muslim Brotherhood came in and provided the muscle and organization for the demonstration. They were organized, they knew what they were doing, they came in there. In addition, they got the support of the army. On February 1st, after January 25th, the revolution began, the army issued its first proclamation. And what did the army say? We support the goals and objectives of the people who are in the square. They, the military command in Egypt, when they did that, were not sure that they were not going to be attacked by the Mukhabarat and other security forces. They were very worried about that. They had to secure their own places in case something happened, because they knew how revolutionary what they were saying was. If they had had their way, they would have let Mubarak serve out, go out in September and leave and have some grace. But the situation moved so quickly that by the 11th, he was taken out. Here's the strange thing from my perspective and how we Americans. We call the events of June 2013 as a coup because you had the demonstrations in the street, and 3 days later the military removed the president and put in place a civilian government that was there for a transition government for a year. But we don't call 2011 a coup. In 2011, the military came in, put out the president, and for the next 17 months, the Supreme Military Council, not a civilian government, but the Supreme Military Council ruled the country, and that was not a coup. It is very hard for Egyptians to sometimes understand where Americans are coming from. But anyhow, they stayed there for 17 months. They had an election, and they elected the Muslim Brotherhood. That was a very important moment for the Egyptian military. Do we honor that decision with all the risk of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power, or do we not? And the military said, they won, we'll let them rule the country. And they stepped aside. But over the next year, the Muslim Brotherhood demonstrated, not just to the military establishment, but to the overwhelming majority of Egyptian people, that they were not Egyptians first, they were international Islamists first. And that ran right up against this Egyptian identity, that we're Egyptians. We have this civilization. This is where we come from. The Brotherhood put out a constitution that was supported by 54% of the population. They took power. They concentrated power. There was a speech that the President Morsi gave in June before he was put out of power, which called for the Egyptian people to go fight in Syria against the Assad regime for the Islamic forces. Do you have any idea how different events in Syria would be today if the Egyptians were participating on the side of ISIS at the same percent of the population as the Tunisians are? They're double the number of ISIS forces. It would be a disaster. The Egyptian people said, no, we need to save Egypt. The offer was made to Morsi. Let's have elections. You have your constitution, everything's in place, you've been a transition president, let's have a new election. No, we're power, we won, we're staying. We had 51% of the vote, we're staying. You had these huge demonstrations on June 30th. Many magnitudes greater than the January 25th revolution. Many magnitudes. And the army stepped in to avoid the civil war that was coming and took over. And they went to the transition, and President Sisi stepped down, got elected president. Are these guys Democrats by our standard? Absolutely not. Democracy is not the priority of the Egyptians at this point. The preservation of the state and the Egyptian people are. Security is number one. They see themselves, the overwhelming majority of Egyptians, in an existential struggle against radical extremist people. They will not call them Muslims even. They call them radical extremists, who are tearing apart Syria, who are tearing apart Iraq. Gaddafi is gone, but Egypt's being flooded with weapons from Libya to help opposition forces in Egypt. They see themselves as an island struggling against instability in the region. And they see the basis for all of this in the Muslim Brotherhood. We, Jerry and company, believe the problem with Egypt is the Egyptians are not being inclusive, and they should be including the Muslim Brotherhood into the decision-making process. The Egyptians say, what are you talking about? You would not do that. They're against the state. They're trying to destroy everything that's Egyptian, and we'll end up like these guys over here. They point out to you that the leadership of ISIS, the leadership of Al-Qaeda, all found their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. Therefore, we cannot accept them back into society unless they accept us. What's important here, this is not anti-Islam. The Salafis, the Noor party, are allowed to participate because they are loyal to Egypt first, even though they're radical in their religious beliefs. They're still Egyptians first. They're seen as that. So the question I have is, do we look at the struggle in the Middle East for the future as a battle that's being fought for the hearts and minds within the Sunni Arab community? Or do we see it in these nation-state configurations? How and who can fight for the hearts? We can't. We're here. We're Americans. They look at us and we say, no, we can't do that. But who in the region today is fighting that battle within the Sunni Muslim community? It can only be people there. That's where we should be putting our energies. And if we defeat tomorrow, I have complete faith if the United States government decides we're going to destroy ISIS militarily, we can do that very quickly and with a lot of energy, and we do it. But the question is, what comes next? What the battle is a philosophical battle that those people themselves have to struggle with. How do we, as outsiders who don't belong there, how do we assist in that battle? What can we do that's useful? And the problem is, we're limited. You know, we are very, very limited of what we can do. And the other thing is, we don't do something that Americans are famous for. The great strength of our country has always been we can adapt and change our thoughts on situations. You know, I mean, I always begin these things usually by being humble and saying, anybody who's worked Middle Eastern issues has been wrong. I like to say that when President Sadat said to the Egyptian parliament he would go to Jerusalem if invited, you're looking at the guy who wrote the memo to the president that said he will not go. He was there 3 weeks later. Fortunately, when you write every day, you can say, further information indicates he may well change his mind. Yeah, you can change. But the thing is, we should get up every morning and reevaluate our positions and see where we're going. Another example is Assad. There's nobody in this room who personally dislikes the Assad regime more than I do. And if we take 5 minutes, I'll explain why, and you will agree with me I have a justification. That said, you have to be an analyst as an American and say, why is he still there? President said he was going to be gone in 6 months, 4.5 years ago. What has changed? Why do these people come to him? Do they like him? I don't believe the Syrian people like Assad. I believe the Syrian people, because of this communal identity, see him as better than the alternatives. The other thing on Syria, many people, even some who's in this conference, will tell you the United States believes in the rule of law. Then ask the simple question, under what law, international law, are we arming people to overthrow the internationally recognized government? That's not the rule of law. You know, on what basis are we bombing Syria? How is that within the rule of law? We may not ask those questions, but I promise you people in the region just say, well, Americans say one thing, but they do something else. We need to be a little more responsive and perceptive of what they're saying and doing. It's hard. It's difficult. And it's not because our guys aren't good. Don't mistake what I'm saying is. We have the best people who are in our government. They work hard. They do a good job. They look at things. We just need to be a little more open to new ideas, all of us as Americans. Thank you.
We have a few minutes to take questions, if anyone is interested in asking one.
So I have a question about Tunisia because it's the first time I've heard it mentioned so much in the last 10 years, in my lifetime probably, as in this conversation. So I'm curious what the correlation that you see is between the relative success of the Arab Spring there and its involvement in international terrorism in ISIS or ISIL. And I'm also, in a related note, curious about, you mentioned the institutional framework in Tunisia being responsible largely for its success there, and if there's any other components, of that that you think contribute to its success.
Well, in terms of why do young men and young women join these violent extremist groups, and what is the attraction? I think books have been written about trying to understand all of that. I think it's an interesting case, and certainly in Tunisia and in Morocco also, where you see a similar phenomenon. Some of these issues that we talked about the unemployment, about the frustrations of young men, about their inability to achieve any kind of stable foundation, stable life going forward, are strong motivations and strong attractions. You have groups, and Graham talked a little bit about some of the basis for why people today in the Middle East often identify themselves as Sunni or Shia. And I think that there is the whole issue of religiosity and of, frankly speaking, years ago when I was in the Counterterrorism Bureau, we had a conference with counterparts from the Maghreb, and one of the things that we were talking about is the failure of religious education in these societies, and the need actually to improve the way young people were taught about Islam and how to understand their religion in the context of societies more broadly of comparative religion. They didn't do that, and therefore it left many of these young people very vulnerable to very twisted messages about what it means to be a Muslim and what it means, for example, to be called to jihad. And unfortunately, we're seeing some aspect of that right now. In terms of some of the institutional foundations in Tunisia, we talked a little bit about the fact that the government was able to sustain various social services, that the schools continue to operate, the health services continue to be provided all through this period of social and political upheaval. But there's also, more broadly speaking, I mean, in many ways, the interesting thing about Tunisia is that if you looked at it, you would say that would be one of the ones that was most vulnerable to civil conflict. And by the way, I want to say Graham's point about the sense among many people in the region that they have to avoid, they have to negotiate, and they have to achieve consensus, because if they ever go into a period of armed conflict, it would be very difficult to stop it, is exactly right. And that's what we're seeing right now in Libya and in Yemen. When the political conflict in Tunisia was really reaching an apex, a climax, you had other groups that were able to come in, and so you had in Tunisia a very strong labor movement, the UGTT, which played a central role in bringing the political parties together and forcing them really to negotiate and to arrive at consensus decisions about how to go forward. And so some of those things that you found in Tunisia, for whatever reason, were lacking elsewhere.
Thank you.
What role, if any, is China playing in the Middle East?
China plays an increasingly important role, and primarily on the economic side. I mean, the Chinese, generally speaking, don't get terribly involved in political issues, but I will say that when we were in Yemen and trying to help the parties mediate and come to a decision, we were able to put together a group with all of the 5 ambassadors from the permanent members of the UN, so the U.S., the UK, France, Russia, China, to work together. And the Chinese actually, in their own way, played a pretty positive and constructive role in trying to advance what we as the international community were trying to achieve there. Generally speaking, they're not terribly comfortable doing that. They'd much rather talk about buying stuff or selling stuff, and that's what they're going to do. But increasingly, we're seeing that they're becoming much more assertive in the region. The Chinese Navy is operating in the Indian Ocean in a way that it never did before, and also on the Persian Gulf side, using their relationships in Pakistan in particular They're developing a naval base at a place called Gwadar in Pakistan, which is going to allow them to project power out into the Gulf, again, in a way that they never have in the past. And so I think as we go forward, we're going to see the Chinese playing a much more visible and much more aggressive role in the region. Whether they're going to want to get involved in some of these difficult political issues is another story. It's not what they like to do naturally.
I'd like to just add to that if I could. The Chinese you see all over the place now. I mean, where there's Chinese language centers, there's Chinese activity. They're quite active. In addition, they're helping build ports. In Egypt, they're working on building a port. The thing about the Chinese is they don't come into these countries and lecture them on how they should run their own country. Unlike us, we tell them how they should run their country, and we're not appreciated for that. I think the Chinese are much more like we were 100 years ago. I mean, they're taking advantage of all the things. We took advantage of what the British were doing. They're taking advantage of what we're doing.
Thank you.
What hope do you see for a resolution in Yemen, and have our drone strikes, in your opinion, helped that situation or made it worse? Thank you.
Two different things, of course. In terms of where we are in trying to resolve the situation, I think we, of course, are supporting the UN process. Ismail Ol-Sheikh Ahmed, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, has been extremely active in trying to put together a way forward on the negotiations. We did one round of talks in Switzerland in December. We're hoping that another round will start maybe in another week or 10 days. They did make some progress in the first round in at least trying to map out some of the areas that they needed to develop. We're hoping that the second round they'll actually be able to agree on some of the things. The Houthis, interestingly, took some steps in the last couple of days. They released one of the ministers that they've been holding prisoner for quite a few months. They also released a couple of Saudis that they were holding. So there is maybe some reason for optimism that we can get the process going. In terms of the drones, I have to admit, and it's not always. At least in Washington, not everybody always appreciated it, but frankly speaking, I think that the drone program was important and right, and certainly when I was there as ambassador, I supported it and participated in some of the decision making. I think that when we had good cooperation with the Yemenis on going after some of these hard targets with Al-Qaeda, we did make some progress. We did open up some space. Unfortunately, this last 18 months of political chaos has reversed some of the progress that we were able to make. But I think that done correctly and with all of the appropriate caution and carefulness, it is a tool that helps. But one thing that's important in the area of counterterrorism, whether we're talking about Syria or Yemen or Libya or any place else, and that is the recognition that none of these activities, whether we're talking about drones or other kinds of military kinetic activities, are going to settle your problem. They are a tool that can buy you time. And that can help improve the conditions that allow the other things that you need to do, like building institutional capacity, helping your partner countries to strengthen their own capabilities. Those are the things ultimately that are going to succeed in the fight against extremist organizations.
Let me say something. I'm less optimistic than Jerry. It's his job to be optimistic, I should put it that way. I'm a historian. And I like to point out that from 897, that's 897, until 2011, that's 1,114 years, the leader of Yemen was a Zaidi. In 2011, the Saudis engineered a transition in which the leader of Yemen became a Sunni. I was amazed that no one didn't see that at the time that that was going to be a problem. And when you see today the struggles that are going on, the Saudi-led coalition tends to be more concerned about crushing the Zaidi population and in the north than they do seem to be concerned about the spread of the influence of Al-Qaeda as they continue to capture cities, including the largest city in Hadramaut, and moving up within 33 miles of Aden, controlling towns there. This, to me, shows you what their real value, what the battle that's going on here. It is an identity battle on what we're going to be, who are going to be Yemenis. And I don't see the Yemenis willing to compromise on that identity, the Yemenis being the Zaidis and the Sunnis that are in their area, and the Saudis who are determined to crush them because they see them as a bridgehead for the Iranian threat, which we think is somewhat exaggerated.
I'll correct you later.
So time for...
We had dinner together a month ago, and we had this total discussion.
This has been civil, more civil than I thought. One question from each side, because we're running a bit over time.
Yeah, I just want to first thank you for, you're the first government official that ever said winning the hearts and minds as an American is nearly impossible. That was my experience, at least. My question for you, though, is you talked about how the fragmentation, how there's possible fragmentation of other countries in the Middle East right now. Do you think recognizing a Kurdish state, since they've been our allies and we've been doing raids with them against ISIL, and even back in the Iraq War, recognizing them as a state would bring regional stability to that area, and maybe a bastion of hope, since they're a little bit more moderate in their peoples they identify as Kurdish, whether they believe in Zoroastrian or Christianity or Islam?
What I would say is, and again, this goes back to the point about Sykes-Picot and how do we see these states, Iraq and Syria and the others, and whether or not they are viable as nation states, and you can bring them together. I think that from our own perspective, it is important to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq as it exists today, and that the concern, and some people have laid out a scenario where Iraq basically breaks up into three component parts: a Kurdish north, a Shia south, and a Sunni center. There are a couple of problems with that. One is that all of the oil is in the north and in the south, and so you're leaving the Sunnis with a lot of sand and not very much else, and that is inherently destabilizing. And then the other point is that, as an aspect of Saddam Hussein's policies during the period of his tenure, there was a lot of mixing of populations, and so if you were to try to divide up the country into an independent Kurdistan, there would be almost immediately a conflict over who gets Mosul, which is economically extremely important, and both the Sunni and the Kurds claim it. So I think that our sense is that if you were to look at the breakup of the country, you would be looking at a much longer and probably bloodier conflict inside of that country. Having said that, I think that we do certainly recognize that the Kurds need a greater level of autonomy, and what we've been trying to accomplish, and certainly what the Abadi government in Baghdad has articulated is a government that is much more decentralized, that emphasizes autonomy, and it goes back to some of the comments that Ambassador Pickering made earlier on about the Sunnis and how they perceive their own role in a future Shia majority population of Iraq. And that if you can push decision-making down, if you can give much more control and authority to people at a local government level, that perhaps you can help address some of their legitimate concerns about their place in their society while maintaining the territorial integrity.
I just want to say this. I have no idea how you're going to solve these problems. All I know is that since we've interceded, we have created a whole lot of suffering for a lot of people in the region, and we haven't helped them. I like to point out that when we invaded Iraq, there were 1.5 million Christians there. Today, there's less than 500,000. We have destroyed people. We didn't mean to. We had the best intentions. We were trying to do something good, but it didn't work out that way. When it comes down to how it works out in the end, the Iraqis are going to have to solve it themselves. We can't impose it upon them. We can best be a moderator, but even that we're questioned by everybody on who we're really loyal to. We carry a lot of baggage in Iraq right now, and how much good we can do is limited. And I'm saying that as somebody from Washington, because in Washington, we believe we can solve everything in Washington. You can see how successful we've been. But it is going to be very hard for us to do much good in Iraq at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Feinstein and Dr. Bannerman, for being here today and providing a service to the Boise State, the Frank Church Institute, and the United States of America, home and abroad. My question for you today is, in the planning process for any statements or military action in the Middle East and Near East regions, where are the obstacles and how have we overcome them when putting together a plan for these actions?
Well, I think that it goes through the interagency process, and the National Security Agency, the National Security Council, and ultimately, of course, the President. And so generally, what happens is that, depending, there are different ways of doing it, but if a decision is made to look at a military intervention or anything else, usually what will happen is that the military, in this case Central Command, would be tasked with doing what's called a CONOP, a concept of operations, that they would put something together that would then be presented to the interagency and debated. It would work up, it would go through the Joint Staff and then the Defense Department and then into the interagency, where it would be reviewed and discussed, and like I said, ultimately the President would make a decision about whether that's something that he wants to do or not.
Let me just say that the U.S. military can do whatever it's assigned to do. What we've learned over the last decade and a half, it's very hard in helping societies develop after the military has gone in there. We at the United States Institute of Peace have spent a lot of time in Iraq and places like that, building civil society organizations and doing the like. But in the end, even the best efforts by us are only supportive of what the people on the ground want. And until they reach a political consensus, you can't impose it militarily, and you can't impose it from us outside. We can be assistance, we can help, but that's all we can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Bannerman.
Our second panel this morning is titled "The ISIS Crisis, How Should the World Respond?" And of course, that is really the foreign policy question of the day. The panel moderator is Dr. Michael Allen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boise State, whose focus is on conflict and power disparity. He is the author of the forthcoming articles, Deadly Triangles, Blog Consumption, and International Relations, and Putting Our Best Boots Forward. Dr. Allen. And the panelists, please.
Good morning. I would first like to begin, of course, by thanking the Frank Church Institute, as well as Gary Winsky, for both putting this together, as well as inviting us all here to have this panel today. In addition, I would like to thank all of you for being here, because certainly the three of us could talk amongst ourselves, but it would be a lot more enjoyable with all of you here, as well as the people who are watching this online, streaming it over the internet. Our plan for today, of course, is to have our two panelists speak. They'll speak roughly for 15 to 20 minutes apiece, and then we'll take your questions, and discuss the issues that you raise. So I'll first introduce our panelists, and then I will partly introduce the topic, and then our panelists will speak. Our first panelist is Stephen Schlesinger, who has worn a few different hats over his long career, including being a freelance writer, a columnist, a staff writer, an editor, a chief political correspondent, a book author, a speechwriter, a foreign policy advisor, elections monitor, advisor to the director of the United Nations Human Settlements Program, a professor, a visiting scholar, and the director of the World Policy Institute. He recently edited the volume The Letters of Arthur M. Schlesinger, in addition to several media appearances and author columns that he's written. His recent interviews and works include discussions about the Islamic State, Iraq, and Syria, the United Nations history, its 70th anniversary, which happened in the last year, and the possibility for reform of the United Nations. Our second panelist will be Dr. Nader Hashemi, an associate professor of the Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. His works include a forthcoming volume titled Iran's Green Movement, A Political and Intellectual History, a 2013 volume called The Syria Dilemma, and has published work on the Arab Spring, secularism and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and the gulf between authoritarian regimes of the Middle East and the surge for democratization by the people within those regimes. In addition to his scholarly work, he has given several public lectures on the Islamic State, Iran, and Hamas, as well as participating in radio and television interviews and writing for outlets like CNN.com and the Denver Post. Please welcome our panelists. So our topic for discussion today is a popular one, at least in my mind, and based on the conversations I've increasingly had over the last few months, and it's the ISIS crisis. How should the world respond? The topic is fascinating to me because in some real ways, Americans in the past few months have become more focused on Iraq and Syria than they have been perhaps half a decade ago or even a decade ago, as this seems perhaps a little bit more relevant to their day-to-day lives and how it affects them. And this interaction both exists in terms of the things that they care about daily, as well as what U.S. foreign policy may be over in the region. Naturally, Iraq has been a household topic at various times over the last 3 decades, including in the 1990s, as well as 2002 and 2003, and has resurged again. And that's partly also due to our media consumption, that Iraq may fall down several links on our favorite media websites, but then lately has been coming up as either front page news or in the top couple of links that we may click on either CNN, Fox News, or MSNBC. As a result of that, it has entered more so our daily conversations than when we had maybe in the last couple of years where we were less involved in the region. But certainly our effects has been felt. Now, the evolution of the Islamic State has been heavily influenced by the United States. This should come as no surprise, but it's been influenced by both major and minor actions towards the region. In terms of major actions that have influenced the growth and also slowed the growth of the Islamic State, we have things such as the initial sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s, followed up by the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the disbanding of the Iraqi military shortly afterwards, after the United States had occupied the country, as well as the surge of 20,000 troops in 2007 certainly had disastrous effects on the Islamic State. Additionally, withdrawing our troops as well as arming the rebels and our continued bombing campaign presently have all affected the group, which has had an interesting, as I've already mentioned, evolution. The organization initially started in '99 as al-Zarqawi Salafist, partly developed the organization as a response to the anti-Salafist policies and laws in Iraq proper, but that organization gained a lot more popularity in 2003 as a potential for Sunni and Salafist organization or organized violence against the current or the Shia government as well as the American occupation. This shifted to a coalition of several groups that represent a perhaps wider view or a wider approach to try to remove the government that was in power, as well as represent Sunni Muslims who were violently opposed to the government. And in 2006, al-Zarqawi is killed and is replaced by, well, al-Zarqawi, I should mention, is Jordanian. He's replaced by Egyptian in 2006, al-Mazri. And this period from 2007-2010 is the period of the U.S. surge where much of the Islamic State's leadership and structure changes as a result of Iraqi and American operations, eventually leading to al-Baghdadi taking over the leadership of the Islamic State in 2010 Iraqi. And the organization shifts from one that's foreign-controlled and affiliate of al-Qaeda to one that's more Iraqi control, and the subsequent actions leads to a large split between the Islamic State and al-Qaeda proper. In fact, this is due to their interference in the opposition and increasing violence in Syria, starting their own front, al-Nusra, that is initially an independent front. Then they try to take it over. They fight the al-Nusra front, and this fight leads to them taking control of that movement within Syria, and al-Qaeda, not being happy with them, completely splits off and rejects the Islamic State as a proper front of their conflict with the regimes in the area as well as the West. Now, they have their operations both in Iraq and Syria and seem to have a longer reach with active operations in Nigeria, Libya, Yemen, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula, as well as taking actions in France and inspiring attacks recently within the United States. It's these attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, the inspired attacks in San Bernardino, that are certainly making Americans and the general public more aware and more interested in what both U.S. foreign policy is in the Middle East, as well as our effects and long-standing effects within those regions. But also is of interest because there are policy questions that seem to be something that we may be able to influence at a local or state level that has implications for U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy is usually determined at the national level, but our policy towards refugees may be something that can be influenced at both the state and local levels in determining whether or not we are a welcoming community or unwelcoming community to refugees from the area. And this could perhaps, even though we cannot necessarily guide national foreign policy, may have effects for foreign policy as a whole, depending on how communities respond to the influx of refugees from the region. Importantly, there are certainly security dimensions to the flows of refugees who may or are coming to the United States, but there's also security dimensions that are often not addressed. One of the big things that I'll mention before moving to our panelists is that in 2014, we thought a lot of the Islamic State's revenue came from oil, and we only had vague estimates of how much money they were getting from oil, as well as other lootable resources, such as the banks they were taking over and the money they were able to get from those banks. But within the past, few months, we got a budget from one of the regions that the Islamic State controls in Syria, and got to see what their budget was for November to December of 2014, 2015. And this is a oil-rich region in northeast Syria, where only about 25% of its budget came from oil. 66% of the budget came from taxes on individuals, confiscations from individuals, as well as of extortion from individuals, suggesting that the Islamic State relies heavily on people to be able to finance its conflict against both the governments there as well as the broader conflict against people elsewhere. Importantly as well is that the Islamic State has realized this and has been somewhat flustered that Sunni Muslims don't necessarily want to live within its territory, and has created propaganda videos such to suggest to people, no, you don't want to go to Europe and elsewhere, you should stay here within Iraq and Syria, and trying to make sure people stay so that they will have a continued source of revenue beyond the lootable resources that they capture. Another potential dimension to the policy questions that we are debating domestically here as well. So with that, I invite our first panelist, Stephen Schlesinger, to come up. Thank you.
Shall I do it from here?
It's your choice.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind of impressionistic introduction of my career. I'd like to thank Gary Wensky for inviting me, and of course being here at Boise State University at the Church Institute, which I last visited about 10 years ago. I'm delighted to be back in Boise. This is an event that I think is not only timely, it's an event on the Middle East, but one that has become one of the central issues in our presidential race. Indeed, it may be the issue which makes or breaks the candidacies of the competitors in both of our major parties. Now let me explain my own presence here. Usually I write about the United Nations, which is my area of specialization. However, that has inevitably meant that I have to address the conflicts in the Middle East because they impinge so directly on the UN, its work over the years. It's preoccupied the organization literally for decades. And in saying that, I want to say that I cannot claim any expertise myself in the Middle Eastern affairs as these other panelists who've had deep experience in the region. But I did find myself, as a result of the Middle East UN interaction, investigating the issue of terrorism in that region, which in turn has led me to put my own thoughts on paper on what the threat of terrorism really means today for our world community. Last November 18th, I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post online site following the horrific attacks in Paris. Something had struck me as odd at that time in the sense that the massacre in France had occurred just as the famous terrorist group, the Islamic State, had been experiencing its most serious setbacks in its wars against the Iraq and Syrian governments. Was it possible, I thought, that the violent and deranged killings in Paris might actually be a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength by ISIS? That these grisly and demonic actions were a deliberate effort by the most extreme followers of ISIS to initiate mayhem in a distant European city in order to deflect attention from the deteriorating situations in Iraq and Syria that their organization was now facing. Following this line of thinking, I composed the following essay, which I will now read to you if you will indulge me. It's only a paragraph in length. It's entitled, "Why ISIS May Be on the Verge of Collapse." Here's what I wrote. Quote, "The world may be looking at the attacks in Paris through the wrong lens. The actions of ISIS may constitute measures of desperation rather than any evidence of its expanding power. The recent successful ISIS assaults on the Russian plane that flew over Sinai, you may remember, right around that time, the suicide bombings in Lebanon, which also happened right around that period, and it's the successful plots in France, all within a few weeks of each other, would seem at first blush to be proof that ISIS, pumped up by its achievements in Iraq and Syria, has broadened its strategy to now strike beyond the Middle East into Europe, Russia, and possibly the United States. But on closer look, these egregious crimes, in fact, may be attempts to deflect global attention from the severe setbacks which ISIS has lately experienced in the Middle East that has decimated its force structure and reduced the amount of territory it holds in the region. The turning point, it appears, came in the battle over Kobani 2 years ago when ISIS dispatched hundreds of its fighters to try to seize that city, but ultimately had to withdraw at a great loss of life due to the dozens of U.S.-supported airstrikes and the counter-assaults by Kurdish troops. And earlier this last November, Kurdish forces, helped by the U.S. bombing raids, forced ISIS out of Sinjar, Iraq, thereby cutting its critical supply route between Raqqa, Syria, and Mosul in Iraq. Finally, the U.S. scored a major propaganda victory when one of its drones killed the infamous Jihadi John, the man responsible for beheading a slew of Western hostages. In short, ISIS has publicly begun to be seen to lose its primacy, and thus it has a need to strike out. But this, as I said, represents weakness, not strength. This does not mean that ISIS is on the verge of collapse, but it does mean that ISIS's survival may soon be in question. That ended the paragraph that I wrote for Huffington. Now, as a result of this piece, I got a nice email from Gary Wensky asking me if I would be willing to come out to Boise to speak at this conference to elaborate a bit more on why I wrote what I wrote. Well, there is a central raison d'etre behind my piece, which is partly the way I have always approached the notion of ISIS terrorism, somewhat differently than many of the people in our own country. Namely, I have never viewed ISIS as a towering and indestructible foe. ISIS has not represented to me either the coming of a new world war or the resurgence of an old Soviet Union-like conspiracy fomenting cataclysmic showdowns around the globe like the Cuban Missile Crisis, nor was it, in my view, in any way a repeat of 9/11. At best, I felt from the beginning that we were facing a small horde of suicidal fanatics who are taking advantage of the breakdown of order in the Middle East to spook the world with their grotesque tactics and rampages. But really, in the end, this is for me nothing more than a wayward gang of ex-Saddam Hussein henchmen and their paid thugs dressed up in religious garments, claiming allegiance to an imaginary caliphate to justify their criminal activities and their ruthless quest for lucre, power, and territory. From that point of view, I thought we should always view this issue in more proportionate terms. I recall that even one of the biggest hawks in the U.S. Senate, Republican Senator John McCain, himself said last December 9th at a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing regarding the ISIS insurgency, quote, "They are not giants," end quote. And this was after his own party was citing the subsequent killings in San Bernardino, California, as proof that, together with the Paris carnage, we were facing the most fearsome threat to our national security in the modern age. And in fact, in my Huffington Post piece, I even left out additional events that were actually happening at the same time I was writing that piece. Namely, I failed to mention the earlier setbacks ISIS had suffered in losing control of at least 2 other cities in Iraq, Tikrit and Bajai, which Iranian-backed militias had helped Iraq retake. Nor did I recall attention to the so-called Operation Tidal Wave 2, which was a military title for what the U.S. did in bombing ISIS oil fields, refineries, and hundreds of tanker trucks near the Syrian city of Deir ez-Zor. That was happening last November. What really clinched my argument, at least in my view, that ISIS is truly weakening were the assessments by the U.S. military since it began its air war against the terrorists some 20 months ago. According to President Obama speaking after the meeting at the Defense Department last December, using DoD figures, the estimate was that ISIS forces today range between 30 or 40,000 fighters. Now, given that relatively modest enemy size, Obama stated that the U.S. and allies have already reduced the territory which ISIS holds in both Iraq and Syria by 40% since June of last year. Subsequently, the Pentagon put out its own numerical figures, listing the actual targets it had destroyed over the past year and a half. Some 119 tanks, 340 high mobility vehicles, or these are high maintenance trucks carrying men and materials, 510 staging areas, 3,262 buildings, 2,577 fighting positions, 196 oil infrastructure facilities, 3,680 other targets. Now, of course, many observers may contend that these figures are just propaganda for the consumption of the American people and to diminish the public appeal for ISIS around the world. But even if only half of what the Pentagon claims is true, this is tremendous damage to a small bunch of conspirators. Nonetheless, many Republicans, as we know in this political year, continue to argue that Obama has no strategy for getting rid of ISIS, that his approach is weak and disorganized, that he's letting these very perilous problems spin out of control. Some of his opponents have, as a consequence, called for such things as indiscriminate carpet bombing and the possible emplacement of U.S. troops in the region. However, they don't really explain how these particular moves will work any better than what Obama is doing right now. And in fact, many of them seem to become close to endorsing exactly what Obama's strategy is for the moment. And as you recall, Obama's notion about how to defeat this militant organization is the use of air bombing, special forces, including the additional 500 next month, and by next spring another 1,200, the training of Iraqi and Free Syrian Army troops, the pursuit of regional cooperation and global diplomacy, and the use of social media, all tied to the promise not to put U.S. combat troops into the fight. And frankly, as emotions have lately cooled, Obama's approach is beginning to seem more practical and at least on the verge of some sort of success. Something else has caught my eye, giving me even more dramatic evidence of the sagging capacities of ISIS, namely that it is already bumping up against the tribal realities of the Middle East. By this I mean, even absent any American intervention, ISIS would always face insurmountable problems in widening its territory. If you look at the map, ISIS has tried to extend further to the north, but then it hits up against the Kurds. It expands to the east. It goes up against the Iraqi Shiites. To the west, the Alawites, now protected by the Russians. And to the south, the Lebanese, the Jordanians, and the Palestinians. This has meant in practice that most of the land that ISIS has conquered has been desert land, hardly its promise of a thriving caliphate under Sahiri law, which ISIS has long wished for and professed. There's another concrete sign of a ISIS collapse. This comes out most clearly in the 24-minute audio message which the ISIS leader Baghdadi released the day after Christmas, just a few days before the fall of Ramadi. Al-Baghdadi had not spoken publicly since May of 2015. Suddenly, 8 months later, he's on a video recording, audio recording. Now, is this more than coincidence that he suddenly appears on the airwaves just as he's about to lose a major Iraqi city, Ramadi? Of course, in this case, Baghdadi delivered his usual bluster about how well his caliphate was doing, that airplane bombings had not weakened his group, that he would soon be assaulting Israel, and that the Western Crusaders did not dare fight him on the ground because of their fear of the Mujahideen, or his holy warriors. But the real message that comes from the speech, at least in my view, is his plea to fellow Muslims to rally to his cause, to travel to ISIS-held territories and join the movement. What he said, in fact, in his own words were, "We urgently call upon every Muslim to join the fight." Now, it is hard to read that remark in any other way except as an admission that he now feels quite threatened by outside forces, that he needs fresh recruits as soon as possible. His statement, in my view, strengthens the argument that as ISIS grows frailer, it will make more and more outlandish claims of victory in order to disguise the fact that it is confronting its own imminent mortality. And clearly, the more that ISIS is cornered, the more possibility that we will see new dramatic ISIS-inspired sorties outside of the Middle East, as happened in Paris last fall, as happened just this week in Istanbul, Indonesia, and Pakistan, as a way to prove that ISIS is still extant. Frankly, I could even envision that in a moment of terminal desperation, if ISIS ever got its hands on something like a dirty bomb, it would set it off. Fortunately, it does not. Around $600 million in total, $500 million from looting banks, $100 million from oil sales, $20 million or so from selling ancient artifacts or undertaking kidnappings. I remind these skeptics, however, that the continuing outflight of traumatized residents from the urban areas that ISIS controls from energy-related transactions in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, and that a recent UN resolution passed by the Security Council just last month has there was helped by, of course, the U.S. bombing campaign. But in this case, the U.S. and the Iraqis smartly used mainly Sunni troops. The photos in the New York Times was quite incredible. Next is going to be the push to drive the militants out of the Euphrates River Valley and the Tigris River Valley. ISIS is primarily a death cult. It's going to take fierce fighting and prolonged struggles to subdue that city because of its immense size. Sometimes the Russians are doing their own thing at the same time, bombing cities like Palmyra. But all of this, frankly, is taking time, leaving Obama open to increased criticism from the political foes in this presidential race that he's acting too slowly. Yet there are other moves to tighten the noose, which may help Obama. First, the Turks have promised to close their borders to stop potential ISIS fighters from crossing into Syria. That's a bit of a surprise since Prime Minister Erdogan has weaved and bobbed and ducked on this border issue for months and is frankly more interested in wiping out the Kurds than defeating ISIS. So we'll see how that goes. Second, of course, is the so-called Saudi Arabian coalition of Sunni forces that may potentially intervene against ISIS. So again, I don't put much credence in that now that Riyadh has serious feud going on with Tehran. Third, though, is another indice of weakness and panic within ISIS. Its own magazine, Dabiq, has put out word that the group needs Muslim professionals, doctors, mechanics, and computer programmers to shore up its technical and medical facilities. That seems to be an mission that is failing to attract and hold highly trained male and female converts to its mission. Fourth, even the shadowy hacking group, Anonymous, is now vowing to disrupt ISIS's online operations. Lastly, as we all know, because of its supreme arrogance and unimaginable crimes, ISIS has managed to rally a mighty coalition of all the major nations on earth against it. All of this has made ISIS suffer a series of profound psychological blows. It no longer has the look of success. It can't hold cities anymore, and it can't take new ones. It is losing followers. It is in retreat. Now, let me interject words of caution. I doubt that all the U.S. air and Iraq ground assaults will necessarily lead to the complete collapse of ISIS. Most certainly, it will mean that ISIS can at best be contained within a small manageable space, maybe forcing the terrorists at some point to give up or flee or regroup as guerrilla fighters. But a containment paradigm for the moment is not a bad solution. It means at least that the U.S. does not undertake another occupation, which would undoubtedly involve the U.S. forces of up to 100,000 or more, whose very presence would likely reignite and inflame anti-Western sentiments. The real problem the U.S. and its allies face after vanquishing ISIS is replacing that group with a stable substitute government, one which, most importantly, does not further disenfranchise Sunni Iraqis and yet operates within the Iraqi state. The last thing you want to do is put in place a weak successor in a chaotic landscape that may lead to renewed insurgency and civil conflict. So in the final analysis, we have to face the fact that an overall political solution is the only thing that's going to bring any peace to this area. And to accomplish this, we have the following conundrum. In the end, each party in the region has its own interests in any political outcome. The Kurds will insist on taking Mosul from Baghdad and will not advance beyond their traditional boundaries to help other Arabs. The Turks want to block the Kurds. The Iranians want to put down ISIS but fear moderate Sunnis, backed by nations like Saudi Arabia, take over the ISIS territory. They could one day threaten Iran's allies in Iraq and Syria. The Saudis want to ISIS to disappear, but first they want to crush the Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen and forestall any Iranian advances in the region. In any case, with ISIS sympathizers in their own midst, they cannot really turn against their own extremist Wahhabi followers. The Iraqis continue to need the Iranians and the U.S. to defeat ISIS, but also want to hold on to an intact state, which may mean reasserting control over the Kurdish sector and quashing any uprisings of moderate Iraqi Sunnis. The Russians pay lip service to removing Assad, but really want to protect and to safeguard him for their own national security interests. So that all makes it very simple to get a political solution. So we have the Geneva peace process coming up in January 25th, which is crucial, has been mentioned in other presentations. But as maybe some of you already know, many of the Sunni insurgents, that is, opponents of the regime, have now decided to pull out of those talks because they are not happy with the arrangements that have been made. So the question of whether the Russians and the U.S. and Europe can be brought together in some deal with the other players in the Middle East, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have their own conflict going on, which would presumably allow Assad to stay in power a while longer, reach an agreement on ceasefire, launch a collective effort to wipe out ISIS, then establish the terms for an election in Syria. All this is very much up in the air. And frankly, this is the situation that is being faced by the Obama administration, but it can only play the cards it's dealt, and these are the cards, I think, the best ones we have to deal at this point. The worst thing, though, is that as in medieval times, we may be facing a situation where we get into the 30 years war syndrome of back in the 15th and 14th and 15th centuries. That is my worst fear at all, totally, that we face today. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to my thoughts.
Dr. Hashemi. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for staying. Gary, thank you for bringing me back to Idaho. The subtitle of this conference is The Middle East in Turmoil. And so the question that I want to provide a broad and very tentative answer to is, how do we explain the turmoil, and where does ISIS fit into this picture? So what's the best point of departure to understand the ISIS crisis? And I have a PowerPoint slide here that I'm trying to see if I could advance. There it is. How can we best understand the ISIS crisis? What's the best framework of analysis? Is this problem that we're facing, the regional turmoil, the rise of ISIS, fundamentally a byproduct of something that is inherent within Islam or within Arab culture? In other words, if the majority of the people living there were Buddhist instead of Muslim, would we be having these problems? In his State of the Union address recently, President Obama spoke about the conflicts in the Middle East that date back millennia. He's used the phrase ancient sectarian differences to describe the turmoil in the Middle East, suggesting that perhaps we are experiencing something similar to the Christian wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century. There's nothing that anyone can do about them. We have to simply wait until they burn themselves out. Or more recently, is the regional turmoil and the rise of ISIS a function of a failed Middle East policy, a decision to invade and occupy Iraq in 2003 that then gave birth to Al-Qaeda in Iraq? What's the best point of entry to understand this problem? I think there's elements of truth to all of those three scenarios that I laid out, but as someone who has spent most of my lifetime trying to understand and interpret the politics of the Middle East, I locate the origins and the root of the ISIS crisis in the following set of developments. There have been two sets of developments that have been underway in the Middle East for many decades, and now they have crystallized and converged at this moment in time, creating an opportunity for a group like ISIS to insert itself. In other words, the politics of the Middle East are broken, and they've been broken for a very long time, and the rise of ISIS is a symbol of the broken politics of the Middle East. And these broken politics of the Middle East is a function, broadly speaking, of these two sets of intersecting developments. Number one, the legacy of political authoritarianism and political tyranny in the region. And number two, the predictable consequences that flow from state breakdown, war, and state collapse. Now, the question of political authoritarianism is an important one, because the political landscape of the Middle East has been dominated by political authoritarian regimes for many decades. They vary in terms of the intensity and the brutality of some of these regimes. Some are more repressive than others. But decade after decade, these authoritarian regimes have produced a set of pursued a set of policies that have gradually but consistently corroded and destroyed, in many ways, the social fabric of their own societies. And the topic of social cohesion here, I think, is an important entry point to understand precisely what I am talking about. Social scientists have long recognized that stable polities are rooted in a dense network of voluntary citizen associations that help to sustain civil society and community relations. This generates what's called social capital. It produces social trust, cooperation between citizens of diverse backgrounds, thus creating conditions that enhance social integration by cultivating, over time, ties that bind society together, producing peace and internal stability. The legacy of political authoritarianism in the Arab world has produced the exact opposite of these social trends. Instead of social cohesion, there has been social disintegration. Instead of social trust, there has been widespread fear and distrust of others, of strangers, who might be paid informants of the various intelligence agencies that dominate society and whose job millions of people are employed by the Ministry of Interiors of these regimes to spy on their fellow citizens. The net result of these sets of policies over time is the production of a culture of fear, paranoia, anxiety, conspiracy theories, and when the state collapses, it opens the door to social disintegration, and it opens the door to radicalization. And this leads me to the second broad theme, this development that I talked about a moment ago, the theme of the predictable consequences that flow from state breakdown and state collapse. Take the question of Iraq, the country of Iraq. For the past 37 years, almost every single year in this 37-year time period, Iraq has faced ongoing war, either directly or indirectly. From 1980, if you start counting, 8-year war with Iran. It killed about 250,000 Iraqis, destroyed its economy, created a huge debt. There was a short, brief interim period. You had Gulf War I, Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait, another attack on Iraq, and then very punitive and destructive sanctions that were placed on Iraqi society that corroded and destroyed that society in terms of all the human development indicators. That brings us up to 2003, the American invasion and occupation, and you know the rest of the story. Brings us to today. In Syria, there's a similar story. The only difference is the timeline. The effects of the war that has been raging in Syria over the last 5 years are arguably far worse than what I just described in the case of Iraq. By the end of the first year of the Syrian war, all of the leading human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Commission of Inquiry, had charged the regime in Damascus with, quote, war crimes and state-sanctioned crimes against humanity. The UN Secretary General has repeatedly called Syria the biggest humanitarian peace and security crisis facing the world. And every year, the conflict in Syria goes on, and the society and the state continues to collapse. We have about 250,000 people that have been killed in Syria. Half of the population are displaced, either internally or as refugees. Life expectancy, if you look at all of the human development indicators, Syria is a broken and collapsed society. the conflict in Syria has produced the worst refugee crisis in the world in the 21st century. It has produced a chemical weapons crisis. It has produced a rape crisis, a health crisis, a torture crisis, a war against cultural antiquities crisis. And as a result of all of these things, it has produced an ISIS crisis. And it's precisely because of these quasi-genocidal conditions that a fertile soil has been created for the rebirth and the expansion of ISIS. And so if you look at, for example, just to drive the point home, if you were to rank all of the countries in the Arab League, about 22 countries, if you were to rank all those countries on a spectrum of repression, Iraq and Syria, their post-colonial regimes, particularly under the Ba'ath Party, were the most repressive regimes in the Arab world in terms of the nature of the political rule, how they treated society, and the social disintegration that resulted from the policies of these regimes, judged in terms of their torture, their human rights violations, the number of political prisoners. That's unique about Iraq and Syria. What's also unique about Iraq and Syria is what I just described, the predictable consequences that flow from war and state breakdown. That's exactly why I think the Islamic State has set up its so-called state in Iraq and Syria and not in other parts of the Islamic world. Because it's precisely in Iraq and Syria that you have the convergence of these two sets of political processes that have created a vacuum and that have destroyed these societies. The related question is the question of the political legitimacy of the state in Iraq and in Syria. That political legitimacy has eroded. In the post-2003 American order that emerged in Iraq, you had Shiite political parties who had the demographic numbers who won the elections, understandably so. Under Saddam, they were persecuted. They ruled in a majoritarian manner, particularly under Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who we and the rest of the international community were backing. This led to Sunni discrimination, alienation, frustration, and over time, the 20% of the Iraqi Sunni community started to give up, and some segments of that community started to look elsewhere for hope, for representation, and that elsewhere was in ISIS. Syria, you have a similar situation. I would argue the problem there is much, much worse, because you have a minority regime in Damascus, an Alawite regime. All of the senior positions are staffed by loyalists. I describe the regime in Damascus as a criminal enterprise. And the difference in Syria is that you had one family in power for 45 years. And it seems like it would go on, and this has led to alienation and frustration among many Syrians, about 70% of them who are Sunni. And that's why some Syrians have given up and have turned to alternative sources of political imagination. Now this leads to the next slide that I have, that I hope I can, sorry, that went the wrong way. I don't know, can the people in the booth advance the slide, because this clicker seems not to be, there's one, sorry. You know what, I'm going to disperse with the clicker, I'll just continue on given the limited time that I have. The next issue that I think is deeply related to the source of the ISIS crisis is the war in Syria. I've written a long essay on this topic where I've argued that all roads lead to Damascus. General Petraeus, I think, had it right when he noted that Syria is like a geopolitical Chernobyl. It's going to continue to spew radioactivity and instability and extremist ideology over the entire region. Had there not been a conflict in Syria, the likelihood of ISIS emerging would be very small. If you know the story, the origins, the parent organization of ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. As we get to the year 2011, when the American troops were pulling out, most of the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq were killed, imprisoned. That organization was a shadow of its former self. The Sunnis in Iraq still had hope that perhaps they could get representation in a Shia-controlled Iraq. In 2011, the Arab Spring comes to the region. It comes to Syria. and as a direct result of the brutality of the Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, and the mayhem and the chaos and the war crimes and the chemical weapons, a vacuum opens up that allows for al-Qaeda in Iraq to resuscitate itself in the context of the horrors of the Syrian war. Syria is central to understanding the rise of ISIS. Had that conflict in Syria been dealt with more effectively by the international community much earlier on, I would argue that we wouldn't be having an ISIS crisis, a position that finally President Obama himself has acknowledged that without some resolution of the internal political conflict in Syria, there can be no ultimate and effective war and attempt to deal with the bigger problem of ISIS. And so this is a big issue that I think can't be ignored, the question of Syria and what this all means for the region. The Arab Spring, which was talked about in the previous panel, is also central and essential to understand. When democratic openings are closed and crushed, and when moderate forms of political Islam are not allowed to have a voice, you get as a consequence violent and radical interpretations of political Islam rising to the top and capturing the imagination of some young people in the Middle East. The case of Egypt, I think, is a perfect illustration of this situation. You're seeing a rise in political violence in Egypt in the aftermath of the 2013 military coup in significant ways. There's a lot of studies that have chronicled this. I'd be happy to go into the details if someone asks me. What you're seeing inside Egypt today is something to pay close attention to. What you're seeing right now in Egypt is a rise in radicalization, a rise in young Egyptian people looking to ISIS as an alternative, because the only options that you have today, if you're a young person in Cairo, is either you shut up and stay silent and you accept the neo-fascist political order that General el-Sisi has imposed on Egypt, or if you're interested in political change, you look elsewhere. And the only place where you can look elsewhere that seems to be getting a lot of media attention is ISIS. And we know now from the internal debates that are taking place within Egypt's prison systems. There's about 42,000 political prisoners in Egypt, vast majority in the Muslim Brotherhood, but liberals, secularists, and anyone else who opposes the Sisi regime. And people who've come out of that prison system have told us about the internal debates. And guess who's winning those internal debates? It's ISIS. And these are how the debates go. And I'm talking and I'm basically paraphrasing what political prisoners have told me who've been in those prisons. The ISIS supporters walk around with their chests pumped out, arrogant and confident, and mock every other political prisoner from a different ideological orientation, and specifically point to the Muslim Brotherhood and say, "You stupid idiots, we told you so. You put your faith in elections, you put your faith in democracy, you put your faith in the West as if they're going to come and rescue you when situation starts to get tough. Look what happened. Look where we are. Look at the torture." And the political prisoners who are chronicling these stories says everyone in the Egyptian prison system stays silent. No one can answer back because it's taking place in the context of a horrific prison situation where the ISIS followers are saying, look, don't buy into that false narrative of elections and democracy. The West doesn't believe in it. The old guard in this country will not allow free elections to take place. If you want to get involved in political change, come and join us. And that's exactly what's happening in Egypt, and we're all paying the price for that. And this basically highlights just a very simple point about political change that was best, I think, articulated in 1962 by President John F. Kennedy when he famously stated that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. There's actually on this point a very good study that was published by the Center for Combating Terrorism at West Point, a study called Jihadi Discourse in the Wake of the Arab Spring. They looked at what al-Qaeda and extremist Muslim groups were saying in the context of the Arab Spring. When dictators were falling via peaceful revolution, and the study basically says that al-Qaeda had nothing to say. They were incoherent. They had no interpretation that could advance their claims because for years they said the only way to bring about political change in the Arab world was through violent revolution. But the Arab Spring, at least in the early phases, seemed to suggest that there was an alternative approach. And so that is important to keep in mind as we think about the longer problems of political instability in the region. Now, the next point, the last really point that I want to make in the few minutes that I have left is the question of where do the political ideas of ISIS come from? Where do the religious ideas of ISIS come from? I'm of the view that a big part of the ISIS crisis is related to the development and the mainstreaming of a particular Sunni interpretation of Islam that is deeply sectarian, violent, intolerant, specifically toward women and minorities, and supports the use of violence against anyone who differs with this interpretation of Islam. This is a fairly recent interpretation of Islam, and it's connected to what one scholar of the Middle East has called the rise of the culture of ugliness in modern Islam. And this interpretation of Islam is connected specifically to one country in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. When ISIS emerged in the summer of 2014, and we were all exposed to these horrific beheadings that were taking place of Western hostages, one of my students turned to me and said, "Professor Hashemi, why is there such global outrage at the beheading of 5 Western hostages when during the exact same time period 21 people lost their head in Saudi Arabia and the State Department didn't even issue a statement of protest?" If you look at the penal code of ISIS and how they respond to basic issues of crime and punishment, it's identical to what happens in Saudi Arabia. When ISIS wanted textbooks for their schools in their so-called Islamic State, guess where they went? They went to Saudi Arabia. They went to the Ministry of Education and downloaded the texts. This idea, the ideas, in other words, of this intolerant interpretation of Islam can be traced to Saudi Arabia and has become an important problem increasingly, decade after decade, as a result of the marriage of Saudi petrodollars and Wahhabi intolerant Islam. It's gone global. It has infested the hearts and minds of Muslim communities around the world, and it can no longer be ignored. I can tell you a lot of stories. I can draw connections between San Bernardino, between the Boston bombings, between what happened in Paris and Belgium, and this particular interpretation of Islam. And we cannot have, I think, a serious and honest conversation about Saudi Wahhabism and its negative effects and its connection to Islamic radicalism unless we are honest and also acknowledge the very close relationship that the United States of America has had with Saudi Arabia for the last 60 or 70 years, going back to 1945 when then President Roosevelt met with then King Ibn Saud on an aircraft carrier and struck this alliance for largely strategic and economic reasons. But I'm here to tell you that we can no longer ignore the negative and toxic effects that come from Saudi Arabia and the destabilizing effects that flow from Saudi Arabia over the entire region. It can't be business as usual anymore because the cost is simply too high. Now, how we solve the problem of Saudi Arabia, because they are an ally of the United States, they do pursue our interests, but at the same time they oppose our basic values. How we get to solving that political problem, I don't have an easy answer. I'm a political scientist, I'm not in government, I'll leave it to those people in government to try and figure this out. But I am here to tell you that we can no longer ignore what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And this is a big problem. So let me just turn to a conclusion. I know I'm over time here, but what's happening in the Middle East today, the instability, the chaos, the rise of ISIS, was actually predicted 14 years ago. In a series of UN Arab development reports written by a team of leading Arab social scientists, they actually forecasted and predicted the deep crisis that was facing the region. And they hinted at a coming explosion. The reports that these social scientists put out noted that the Arab world is at a crossroads, and the region is hampered by 3 key deficits: a freedom deficit, a women's empowerment deficit, and a knowledge deficit. And compared to the rest of the countries in the developing world, the Arab world had very poor indicators. They published a report in 2004 that talked about the theme of freedom, good governance, and political reform. In a nutshell, all of these things were absent. And so let me just end by quoting one of my favorite columnists and public intellectuals in the Arab world, Mr. Rami Houri, who teaches at the American University of Beirut, and he said the following, and I'll end on this note. Quote, "In my 45 years in the Arab world, observing and writing about the conditions on the ground, the only thing that surprises me now is why such an extremist phenomenon that has caused the catastrophic collapse of existing states didn't happen earlier. At least since around 1970, the average Arab citizen has lived in political, economic, and social systems that have offered zero political accountability, political rights, and participation. States have been characterized by steadily expanding dysfunction and corruption. Economic disparities have driven majorities of people into chronic poverty and humiliating inaction. This state of affairs, Rami Khouri goes on to note, has virtually banned the development of one's full potential in terms of intellect, creativity, public participation, culture, and identity. The Islamic State phenomenon is the latest and perhaps not the final stop on a journey of mass Arab humiliation and dehumanization that has been primarily managed by the Arab autocratic regimes that revolve around single families or clans with immense and continuing support from foreign patrons. Foreign military attacks in Arab countries, such as in Iraq, have exacerbated this trend, as has Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. But the single biggest driver of the kind of criminal Islamist extremism that we see today is the phenomenon of several hundred millions of individual Arab men and women who find generation after generation that in their own societies they're unable to achieve their full humanity or potential or exercise their full powers of thought and creativity, and in many cases obtain the basic necessities of life. There is only one antidote in the long run to eliminating the Islamic State and all that it represents, and that is to stop pursuing the abusive and criminal policies that have demeaned millions of decent Arab men and women and shaped Arab countries for the past half-century. Bombing Iraq and Syria will gain some time and probably must happen in a combination with serious military action by local Arab and Kurdish forces. However, if the ways of the corrupt modern Arab security state is not radically reversed, the mass desperation and hysteria that the Islamic State represents will only reemerge again in more extreme forms in the coming years. Thank you.
We're happy to take some brief questions if you all have some. Okay.
I think that last speaker should have been first.
If I may, is the genie out of the bottle on the Wahhabism? I mean, isn't Saudi Arabia taking steps to modify that training?
Isn't Saudi Arabia taking steps to modify what?
Their school system, their textbooks.
No. It's the opposite. And if one wanted to be honest about it, it has to go back. It goes back to the nature of the social contract in Saudi Arabia, where the ruling Ibn Saud family struck a contract with the Wahhabi sort of clerical establishment, where they sort of agreed to respect each other's turf. And now this problem of the spread of this particular interpretation of Islam, as I said, is a problem that goes back many years. If you're a young Muslim kid, for example, today, you want to discover something about your religious heritage, the likelihood of you discovering an interpretation of Islam that has been informed by some sort of Saudi, Wahhabi, Salafi interpretation is very high. The likelihood of you being exposed to a humanistic and ethical interpretation of Islam is very low. Just give you one example. A colleague of mine at Harvard did a study of one particular Muslim community in Birmingham, England. He looked at the literature that was used in the mosques and the local bookstores. 80% of that literature was informed by a Saudi, Wahhabi, or Salafi orientation. I know from my own personal experience. I was born and raised in Canada in a particular Muslim community in southern Ontario near the city of Toronto. I'm old enough to have seen with my own eyes the changes that have taken place from the 1970s when I was a kid to the 80s and the 90s, the changing new wave of orthodoxy that has come in, deeply intolerant, basically informed by various strands of Saudi Wahhabism. It's a big problem. And so I don't think Saudi Arabia is addressing it. I don't think they can address it. I don't know what the solution is in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but I do know that business as usual and staying silent over this is going to make the problem worse.
I wonder if you'd comment on this statement. Frank Church was someone who believed that the Soviet Union would fall of its own weight. He believed that revolutions of the aspirations of peoples should by and large be allowed to run themselves out. He opposed American intervention widely. I don't hear this same restraint and confidence in ourselves among almost any politician today. Frank Church's advice, I think, if followed, would not have led us to the point where we are today, in the Middle East specifically.
I totally agree with you. I must say that, much to my amazement, the one Republican who seems to share that position is Rand Paul. But of course, he's been basically bullied out of the Republican Party. No, I think that has been it's the tension between isolationism and interventionism has been one that has shadowed us throughout our history. And we've had right before the Second World War, that tension erupted, and even the establishment of the United Nations was a tug of war between those two opposite sentiments. So we tend to swing back and forth depending on who's in political office or what the circumstances of fear that engage the country. And I don't think that I think that your proposition is the right one, and I think Frank Church understood that and tried to persuade the American people of that. And unfortunately, it only seems to come into play when, after a disaster like what we did when we went into Iraq without the authorization of the UN Security Council, then we learn the lesson again, and it's a very hard and bitter lesson.
Let me just add something to that, because I think I'm sympathetic to that agreement, to that point of view, but I think there's much more that we have to consider. There's people alive in Bosnia today because 20 years ago, President Clinton decided to intervene to stop what was then a genocide. Now, the problem with that intervention is that it happened 3 years too late, because the genocide began in 1992, and then the arguments that were advanced not to intervene in Bosnia were very similar to the arguments that we're hearing today with respect to Syria. There's no core U.S. national interest there. It doesn't matter. That's what all the realists told us. Well, obviously it does matter now, because as a direct result of the failure to deal with Syria more effectively earlier on, we've gotten ISIS. And now ISIS has come to Paris and to San Bernardino and to many other parts of the world. And so this idea of strict non-intervention, I don't think is going to help us solve these problems, because that effectively was President Obama's policy. You listen to him, you listen to his advisors, they were informed by what the realist theorists of international relations were saying. To quote John Mearsheimer, there's no core U.S. national interest involved in Syria. Well, there's been bombings in 3 major NATO capitals since he made that statement. So my own view, just to summarize it very quickly, when you have a regime that is engaging in activities that constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and or genocide, then I think the lessons of history, the lessons of Bosnia, the lessons of Syria, and I can cite other examples, are that if we ignore those atrocities, thinking that they're just going to disappear and they won't come and affect us, the ripple effects won't affect us in one way or the other, then that's a miscalculation. And that's what really R2P, the responsibility to protect, was supposed to solve. It came out of the horrors of Bosnia and Rwanda. The lessons haven't been learned, and now we're dealing with another problem. And the longer we wait, the more the problem gets worse.
Thank you both for your time. I just wanted to follow up. You've mentioned that ISIS is losing ground, certainly, but their resources in wealth and manpower seem to be fairly strong at the moment. So given the prevalence of Wahhabism that you mentioned, do we have any way to gauge the change in opinion, the popular support for ISIS in Islamic nations? Is it increasing, decreasing, or at about a neutral rate at the moment?
I think most experts say that, you know, it's a momentum issue, that when ISIS was spreading and taking over cities, it became a mark of success that attracted a lot of followers who otherwise might not have joined the ranks of ISIS. But once ISIS is start to be defeated, when it's losing cities, when it's losing some of its territory, it no longer has that aura of success, and therefore it's, I think, starting to lose that kind of attraction that is bringing followers from around the world to its ranks. However, the real question is, even if you defeat ISIS, because these problems that our other speaker has been mentioning, some new groups spring up in order to represent the discontent that still exists in the Middle East. I think that's the real problem, which we will any world attempt to settle what's going on in the region is going to face, and so you do have to, in the end, have a political solution which takes into account all the discontents that were cited in that UN report way back, 10 years ago?
Yeah, more than that, 14 years ago.
14 years ago. And so that, to me, is the biggest problem we face.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that observation. We could crush the Islamic State tomorrow or, let's say, next week. But as long as the social conditions that I outlined at the beginning of my talk remain in place, the breakdown of states, the legacy of authoritarianism, political tyranny, the absence of democratic political openings, and the ongoing presence of this very dominant strand of Wahhabi Orthodox Islam that is global now, then we'll crush ISIS tomorrow or next week, but I guarantee you it's going to emerge in some other iteration somewhere else in the Middle East, as long as those social conditions are in place. And so one thing that sort of struck me recently is, why does it feel like we're going through another 9/11 moment here? We killed bin Laden, we killed Zarqawi, it seemed like things were going well, but now we're back again to the same problem, because we're not dealing with root causes. And this speaks to another problem that I think really needs to be addressed, and maybe this could be the theme of the next conference, I don't know. But what is the U.S. grand strategy for the Middle East? Do we have one? The strategy seems to mean putting out fires, short-term vision, revolving around electoral cycles. Do we have a vision for where this region is going or should be going, and what role we can play with our partners in the region 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road? I don't see that conversation happening. And I guarantee you that we're going to be having moments like this where everyone's scared, understandably so, until we start dealing with root causes that are fundamentally not difficult to understand. They're rooted in basic themes of political and human development. We ignore those things at our own peril. I think that's the lesson of the ISIS crisis.
Thank you both for the discussion.
Thank you all for coming this morning. This concludes the morning sessions. I will ask the speakers on the program to stay on the podium while there are any press questions for them. Those who are registered for the lunch, it's the Hatch Ballroom down the hall. We're completely sold out if you're not registered, but the speaker at the luncheon will be streamed online also.